I am Zuri, and I am 28 years old. When I was 14, my parents believed my sister and her vicious lie and kicked me out into a freezing Atlanta storm. Get out. I do not need a sick daughter, my father yelled, as the cold rain lashed against my face. 5 hours later, the police called them to the local hospital. When my father walked into the emergency room and saw exactly who was sitting by my hospital bed, his hands would not stop shaking. You cannot be here, he stammered, his arrogance instantly turning into pure terror. If you have ever been the family scapegoat, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to hear how I turned my childhood trauma into the ultimate weapon and burned their fake empire to the ground. The Sterling family annual Winter Gala was always the most anticipated event for the Black elite of Atlanta. Tonight was no different. The grand ballroom of the exclusive Buckhead Country Club was draped in silver and beautiful crystal. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos drifted through the crowd carrying heavy trays of very expensive sparkling vintage champagne. The room was packed with wealthy politicians, real estate tycoons, and old money families showing off their designer gowns and tailored suits. My parents, Marcus and Valerie Sterling, thrived in this environment. They lived for the optics, the status, and the desperate need to prove they belonged at the very top of the social ladder. I sat alone at a small, dimly lit table, tucked away near the kitchen doors. This was my assigned place. Out of sight, out of mind, and perfectly positioned so I would not ruin their carefully curated family aesthetic in front of their important guests. I took a slow sip of my bourbon, letting the smooth liquid warm my throat as I watched the performance playing out across the room. My younger sister Nia was holding court in the center of the dance floor. She was the undeniable golden child draped in a custom sequined gown that probably cost more than a luxury car. Beside her stood her husband, Preston Vance. Preston came from a legacy white family in Georgia. To my parents, marrying Preston was Nia and her greatest achievement. He paraded around as a wealthy tech entrepreneur, weaponizing his family name completely daily. My parents treated him like royalty, constantly bending over backward to accommodate his every whim, just to stay adjacent to his white privilege. I watched Preston excuse himself from a group of wealthy investors and march purposefully toward my table in the back. His face was flushed with expensive scotch and his usual entitlement. He reached into his tuxedo jacket, pulled out a thick leather folio, and slammed it down onto the glass table right in front of me. The loud smack caused a few nearby guests to turn their heads and look over at my quiet, dark, isolated corner. $50,000, Preston said, his voice loud and dripping with heavy condescension. He leaned forward, placing both hands on the table to loom over me. The invoice for tonight and the gala is right here. Pay it, Zuri. I looked at the leather folio, then up at his flushed face. I did not move. I just kept my hands resting gently on my glass of bourbon. Your parents covered our trip to the Maldives last month, Preston continued, a nasty smirk playing on his lips. So you are covering this. Consider it rent for breathing the exact same air. You should be grateful we even let you sit in the same room as people who actually matter. Before I could respond, the heavy scent of expensive floral perfume hit my nose. Nia appeared beside her husband, crossing her arms and looking down at me with absolute disgust. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my simple, tailored black suit. Honestly, Zuri, Nia chimed in, her voice high and whiny. Look at you. You look like a caterer. You are a college dropout who brings absolutely nothing to the table. You ruin our family aesthetic right here. The least you can do is make yourself useful and pick up the tab tonight. Preston and his investors are here, and we need everything to look perfect. Right on cue, my mother Valerie rushed over. She wore a forced, tight smile, clearly anxious that our interaction was drawing unwanted attention from the elite crowd. She grabbed my shoulder, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into my jacket. Zuri, just pay the bill and be quiet, my mother hissed through her teeth, keeping her fake smile plastered on her face for the onlookers. Do not embarrass us in front tonight, please. We are trying to secure funding for his new real estate application. You have humiliated this family enough with your constant failures. Just take out whatever pathetic credit card you have and pay the venue before I have security throw you out into the street. The street. The street where she had gladly let me freeze 14 years ago. The sheer audacity of her words washed over me, but instead of the familiar sting of childhood rejection, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, calculated amusement. They really thought they still held all the power over me in this terrible life. They really believed I was still the broken, sick teenager crying in the rain. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I took one final deliberate sip of my bourbon and set the glass down on the table with a soft clink. I reached forward and casually slid the leather folio toward me, glancing at the $50,000 total printed on the crisp white paper. I looked up, meeting Preston and his arrogant stare. "You want me to pay the venue, Preston?" I asked softly. "That is funny considering I bought this entire country club yesterday." Preston and his mouth hung open. The smug, entitled grin melted off his face, instantly replaced by a pale, slack-jawed look of absolute confusion. He looked at his wife, then at my mother, waiting for someone to tell him this was a sick joke. But the camera of my memory whip pans directly from his stunned face to my mother. Valerie Sterling, and her eyes narrowed into furious, venomous slits. The diamonds around her neck glittered under the chandelier, but her face twisted into an ugly, hateful sneer. "You buy this club!" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage and pure denial. "You are completely delusional, Zuri. You have been a sick, lying thief since you were 14 years old. You do not own anything. You are just trying to create a scene because you are jealous of your sister. Just like the night you stole Nia and her private school tuition money from your father and his safe to buy drugs. You have always been garbage, and putting on a custom designer suit does not change the fact that you belong in the gutter." She pointed a manicured finger right at my chest, her voice rising above the low hum of the gala. The string quartet playing softly in the background seemed to dissolve into thin air. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the polite laughter of the Atlanta elite faded away entirely. The ambient noise of the country club was suddenly swallowed by a sound that had haunted my nightmares for over a decade. A deafening, earth-shattering crack of thunder. 14 years ago. The memory crashes over me with the force of a physical blow. The air in the grand foyer of our old Buckhead estate was thick with humidity and screaming. I was 14 years old, leaning heavily against the cold marble banister of the sweeping staircase. My entire body shook violently. I was burning alive with a 104-degree fever, my clothes drenched in cold sweat, my vision swimming with dark spots. I could barely keep my eyes open, let alone stand upright. Down in the foyer, my father Marcus was raging. The heavy steel door of his office safe had been left wide open. $5,000 in crisp $100 bills meant for Nia and her upcoming semester at her elite private academy was gone. Marcus paced the marble floor like a caged predator, his face twisted in pure, unadulterated fury. 12-year-old Nia stood backed against the wall. She had stolen that money to pay off older kids at her school who had caught her cheating on a major exam, terrified that the scandal would ruin her perfect reputation. When Marcus demanded to know where the money went, Nia burst into loud theatrical tears. She did not hesitate. She did not show a single ounce of remorse. She raised her small, trembling hand and pointed her finger directly at me as I clung to the banister for dear life. "It was Zuri," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I saw her take it, Daddy. She said she needed it to buy drugs from those bad boys downtown. She threatened to hit me if I told you. Please do not let her hurt me." It was a blatant, ridiculous lie. I was an honor roll student who spent all my time reading in the library. I had been bedridden with a severe flu for 3 straight days, too weak to even walk to the kitchen for a glass of water. Anyone with an ounce of logic would have known a desperately ill, introverted 14-year-old girl did not steal $5,000 for a drug deal. But Marcus did not want logic. He wanted a scapegoat. He wanted an excuse to punish the daughter who did not fit his perfect high society image. He did not ask me a single question. He did not look at my sweat-soaked face or my trembling legs. He charged up the marble steps, his heavy leather shoes thudding like a death march. I tried to speak to defend myself, but all that came out of my throat was a weak, rattling cough. Marcus grabbed me by the collar of my oversized pajamas. His grip was brutal, cutting off my air supply. He yanked me away from the banister. My feet stumbled, unable to bear my own weight, and he practically dragged me down the grand staircase. My knees banged painfully against the hard marble steps. "Dad, please," I gasped, my voice barely a raspy whisper. "I am sick. I did not take it. Please let me go." "Shut your mouth, you lying thief!" He roared, his spit hitting my face. "You bring nothing but shame to this house. You are a disgrace to the Sterling name." I looked desperately over his shoulder at my mother. Valerie stood at the bottom of the stairs, her arms crossed perfectly over her silk robe. She watched her husband drag her severely ill, burning, crying daughter down the stairs. She did not blink. She did not intervene. She simply turned her head away, completely indifferent to my suffering. Nia peeked out from behind our mother, a nasty, victorious smirk playing on her 12-year-old lips. Marcus dragged me across the foyer. He yanked open the massive, heavy oak front doors. Outside, the Atlanta sky was completely black. A torrential, violent thunderstorm was tearing through the city. The wind howled furiously, whipping freezing sheets of rain directly into the house. The cold hit my feverish body like a barrage of icy knives, making my teeth chatter uncontrollably. "Get out!" he screamed, his voice competing with the roaring thunder. He shoved me violently forward. I stumbled over the threshold, my bare feet slipping on the slick, wet concrete of the front porch. I reached out blindly, trying to catch myself, but there was nothing to hold on to. "I do not need a sick, thieving daughter," Marcus spat, his face twisted in absolute disgust. "Do not ever show your face here again." He slammed the heavy oak doors shut. The loud, definitive click of the deadbolt locking echoed into the stormy night, sealing my fate. The freezing rain instantly soaked through my thin pajamas, plastering them to my shivering skin. The fever inside my body waged a violent war against the freezing storm outside. My vision tunneled into complete darkness. My legs gave out entirely. I collapsed hard into the freezing, muddy flower bed beside the porch, the heavy rain washing over my face as the world faded away to black. 5 hours later, the world was a blur of sterile white lights and the harsh, erratic beeping of heart monitors. The camera lens acts as our eyes, now shaking and swaying erratically to mimic the sheer disorientation of the night. It tracks closely behind Marcus and Valerie as they are escorted through the automatic sliding glass doors of the emergency room by 2 uniformed Atlanta police officers. They were not running in with frantic tears of parental worry. They were marching in with rigid, furious indignation. Valerie was clutching her designer trench coat tight around her waist, whispering furiously to Marcus about the absolute humiliation of having a police cruiser parked in their driveway for the entire neighborhood to see. Marcus was practically vibrating with rage. He had prepared his speech on the ride over. He was ready to march up to my hospital bed and scream at me for daring to survive. He was ready to scold me for calling the authorities, for playing the victim, for dragging the pristine Sterling name into a public hospital waiting room in the dead of night. They rounded the corner into the intensive care unit, their faces twisted in identical expressions of aristocratic disgust. Then the shaky camera movement completely stops. It stabilizes, snapping into a slow, smooth, low-angle push-in on the corner of my hospital room. Marcus froze so abruptly that Valerie crashed into his back. The furious tirade died in his throat, completely replaced by a strangled, choking sound. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. There, sitting in a hard plastic chair right beside my bed, was a man who cast a shadow larger than the entire hospital. Grandpa Isaiah, the legendary patriarch of the Sterling family. He was a civil rights-era business titan who had built our family fortune from nothing but grit and unmatched intelligence. He was a mountain of a man with eyes like polished obsidian and a presence that demanded absolute submission. He had cut Marcus out of his life and his vast empire an entire decade ago. Isaiah despised his son. He despised Marcus for his vanity, his corruption, and his desperate, pathetic need to buy his way into white high society. They had not spoken a single word in 10 years. Yet here he was holding my small, freezing hand between his massive, calloused palms, his face set in stone. Marcus opened his mouth, but his jaw just trembled. His hands began to shake violently, rattling the heavy gold watch on his wrist. "Dad," he finally managed to stammer, his voice cracking, pitching upward in pure terror. "You cannot be here! How did you even know?" Grandpa Isaiah did not look at Valerie. He did not look at the police officers who had respectfully stepped back into the hallway. He slowly stood up from the plastic chair. The low-angle shot makes him look like a towering, vengeful god, filling the sterile room with an overwhelming, suffocating gravity. He turned his heavy gaze onto his son, and the temperature in the room plummeted. "You threw my blood into the freezing street like garbage," Isaiah said. His voice was not a yell. It was a deep, rumbling thunder that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of a man who had faced down violent mobs and ruthless corporate raiders, a man who would not hesitate to destroy anyone who crossed him. Marcus took a step backward, physically shrinking under the weight of his father and his absolute disgust. "I can explain," Dad Marcus pleaded, holding up his shaking hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "She is a thief. She stole from her own sister. We had to discipline her. You do not understand what she did tonight." Isaiah took one deliberate step forward, closing the distance. He looked down at the shivering excuse for a son he had raised. "I understand exactly what I'm looking at," Isaiah rumbled. "I am looking at a coward who would rather murder his sick child in the mud than ask a single question that might ruin his perfect reputation. I am looking at a man who has forgotten where he came from and exactly who gave him everything he has." Valerie tried to speak, to use her usual manipulative high society charm to smooth over the unbearable tension. Valerie started forcing a weak, trembling smile onto her perfectly painted lips. "Please let us just discuss this calmly as a family. We can take her home and handle this privately." Isaiah silenced her with a single lethal glare. "You are not family." He stated, his words striking her like a physical blow. "You are a parasite. You both are." He turned back to Marcus, pointing a massive finger squarely at his chest. "From this second on, she is mine. You will never speak to her again. You will never look at her again. If you or your spoiled brat of a younger daughter ever come within 100 feet of this girl, I will personally see to it that your entire life is dismantled piece by piece until you are begging on the street." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, to demand his rights as a father, but Isaiah cut him off, delivering the final crushing blow with absolute finality. "And you," Marcus Isaiah promised, his voice echoing through the quiet hospital corridor. "You will die with absolutely nothing. I will make certain of it." The sound of a hospital heart monitor flatlining blends seamlessly into the sharp clinking of a crystal champagne flute. Snap back to the present day. The harsh, sterile lights of the hospital dissolve into the warm, glowing chandeliers of the Buckhead Country Club. I am no longer a 14-year-old girl shivering in a hospital bed. I am a 28-year-old woman sitting in a bespoke black suit, staring directly into the terrified eyes of the parents who threw me away. The entire ballroom is dead silent. The string quartet has stopped playing. Preston is still standing frozen over my table, his mouth hanging open like a caught fish. Valerie is grasping the edge of her chair, her knuckles turning white as snow. Nia is staring at me, her eyes darting back and forth in frantic panic. I lean forward, resting my elbows on the glass table. I look directly at my father. He is sweating profusely. The exact same tremor from 14 years ago has returned to his hands, rattling the ice in his expensive cocktail glass. Grandpa Isaiah kept his promise. Did he not? "Marcus?" I asked softly, a razor-sharp smile spreading across my face. "He said you would die with nothing." But I decided I did not want to wait that long to see it happen. My father collapsed into the nearest chair, the color completely drained from his face as the realization hit him. If you were watching this unfold, the invisible lens of the room would be circling our table in a tight, continuous loop, capturing the escalating panic of the villains who had tormented me for so long. Marcus was paralyzed by the ghost of Grandpa Isaiah, but Preston Vance was not used to losing control. He was a man who coasted through life on the unearned confidence of a legacy name and generational wealth that he loved to flaunt. Seeing his father-in-law crumble and his wife trembling, he decided it was his job to step in and save the day. He puffed out his chest and marched aggressively toward me, closing the distance until he was towering over my chair. His face was red-flushed with expensive scotch and unadulterated anger. His jaw was clenched tight as he tried to intimidate me with his sheer physical presence. "You do not own anything," Zuri Preston spat. His voice was loud, carefully calculating his performance for the wealthy white investors watching us from the adjacent tables. He pointed a finger practically in my face, leveraging every ounce of his privilege to regain control of the narrative. "My family practically built this city. We own half of Buckhead. You are just a bitter dropout trying to ruin Nia and her special night because you are jealous of everything she has." My mother, Valerie, eagerly latched onto his defense. She nodded frantically, her diamond earrings shaking. "Yes," she gasped, gripping Preston by the arm. "She is lying, Preston. She is a fraud. She does not have a dime to her name. Call the police. Have her arrested for forging documents." Preston sneered down at me, emboldened by my mother and her pathetic desperation. "You hear that, Zuri?" He sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are committing fraud in a private club. I know the chief of police personally. I play golf with him every single Sunday. When I call him, he is not going to listen to a college dropout who sneaked into a high society gala. He is going to listen to me. I am giving you exactly 10 seconds to pack up your cheap little bag and walk out the back door before I have you escorted out in handcuffs for trespassing." He looked around the room, making sure his important peers saw him putting the crazy, disgruntled sister in her place. He used his privilege like a weapon, expecting me to cower the way my parents always cowered to him. He expected me to shrink back, to apologize, to run away into the night, just like I did when I was 14. He truly believed that his skin color, his gender, and his last name gave him absolute authority over me. It was the same arrogant delusion that allowed him to treat my parents like his personal bank account while pretending he was doing them a favor. But I did not shrink back. I did not raise my voice. I just looked up at him with a calm, pitying smile that made the vein in his forehead pulse with rage. I raised my right hand and made a very subtle gesture toward the back of the room. Immediately, the crowd parted as Mr. Sterling, the club manager, stepped out of the shadows. He was a tall, impeccably dressed black man who had run the operations of this elite country club for 20 years. He was a man who had undoubtedly endured countless microaggressions from men exactly like Preston Vance. Preston immediately snapped his fingers at the manager, pointing at me as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into the dining room. Manager Preston barked, his tone incredibly disrespectful. "Call your security team immediately. This woman is trespassing and creating a disturbance. I want her physically removed from the premises right now." But the manager completely ignored Preston. He walked right past the flailing golden boy and stopped directly beside my chair. He did not look at my parents. He did not look at my furious sister. He bowed his head slightly in a show of absolute, undeniable respect. He held out a thick, premium leather folio, placing it gently on the glass table directly in front of me. "The master deed as requested, Madam CEO," the manager said smoothly. His voice carried perfectly, cutting through the heavy tension of the room. "Will you be requiring anything else this evening?" "Thank you, Marcus," I replied deliberately, using his first name to show my authority. "That will be all for now." The manager bowed again and stepped back, leaving Preston standing there looking utterly foolish. I opened the leather folio. Inside rested the master deed to the property, printed on heavy watermarked paper and stamped with a brilliant gold seal. I picked it up, holding it out so the ambient light caught the metallic emblem. I read the heavy embossed lettering aloud, my voice echoing in the dead silent room. I confirmed my holding company, Sterling Heritage Holdings, as the sole legal owner of the venue, the golf course, the tennis courts, and every single blade of grass Preston was currently standing on. I even read the date of the transaction, which had been finalized a full 24 hours before their little party even began. The devastation on their faces was absolutely intoxicating. Preston stared at the legal seal, his arrogant facade cracking right down the middle. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His wealthy investors, who had been watching the entire exchange closely, started whispering among themselves, their expressions turning from amused to deeply concerned. They were businessmen, and they smelled blood in the water. Nia grabbed her husband by the arm, her manicured nails digging into his tuxedo jacket. "Preston, do something!" Nia whined, her voice high and panicked. "Tell them she is lying. Tell them who you are. Make them throw her out." I carefully placed the deed back into the folder and took another slow, deliberate sip of my bourbon. I looked Preston directly in the eyes, stripping away the last ounce of his unearned pride. He had tried to play the privilege card against me. He had tried to use his family history and his supposed massive wealth to crush me into the floorboards. Now it was my turn to show my hand, and I held all the winning cards. "By the way, Preston," I said casually, my voice calm and conversational, but carrying a lethal edge, "how exactly is your family and their grand legacy holding up? Because according to your private bank records, which my acquisitions team thoroughly audited during this purchase, your trust fund ran dry exactly 3 years ago." "Do not you dare talk about Preston and his wealth!" Nia shrieked. Her voice cracked, echoing sharply across the dead silent ballroom. She stepped firmly in front of her husband, throwing her arms out wide, as if physically shielding him from my words. Her face was flushed with a frantic, ugly indignation. "He is a tech CEO. He built a software startup from the very ground up. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter dropout trying to ruin the only man who ever brought real prestige to this family. You are pathetic, Zuri." I did not even blink at her tantrum. I simply stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I stood tall, looking down at Preston, who was practically sinking into his expensive tailored tuxedo. From my vantage point, towering over him, it must have looked exactly like a predator cornering its completely helpless prey. I slowly reached into my sleek leather bag and pulled out my tablet. "A tech CEO," I repeated softly, allowing a cold, dark laugh to escape my lips. "Is that what he told you, Nia? Is that the brilliant story he sold to you and our parents to get you to foot the bill for his luxury lifestyle?" Without breaking eye contact with my trembling brother-in-law, I tapped the screen of my tablet. When my holding company purchased this country club yesterday, I made absolutely certain to take full administrative control of their newly upgraded audiovisual system. With 2 simple swipes, I connected my device to the massive high-definition screens mounted around the perimeter of the grand ballroom. The screens that were meant to display charity auction items and wealthy sponsor logos flickered. Suddenly, they illuminated the dark room with a harsh, glaring white light. Loud gasps rippled through the crowd of elite guests as massive financial spreadsheets, bank transfer logs, and corporate registration documents appeared in 10-foot-tall letters for the entire room to see. The string quartet had completely stopped playing. The waiters froze in their tracks. Everyone was captivated by the digital execution happening right in front of them. "Let us take a very close look at this highly prestigious tech company," I announced, my voice ringing out clearly over the stunned murmurs of the crowd. "Vanguard Solutions, registered as a limited liability company in Delaware, 0 active employees, 0 software products in development, 0 actual corporate clients. It is not a tech startup, Preston. It is a hollow shell corporation, a completely empty entity created for one specific and highly illegal purpose." I tapped the screen again, zooming in on a specific column of bank transfers, highlighting the rows in bright yellow. The numbers displayed were absolutely staggering. Over the last 24 months, Vanguard Solutions has received 42 separate wire transfers, totaling over $2.4 million. But these were not venture capital investments. They were not generous angel investors believing in his vision. They were direct unauthorized withdrawals from Marcus and Valerie Sterling and their primary retirement accounts. The silence in the ballroom was so absolute you could hear a pin drop on the carpet. I watched my mother Valerie stumble backward as if she had been physically struck. Her manicured hand flew to her mouth to stifle a scream. Her eyes grew wide with absolute terror as she recognized her own private banking account numbers displayed in massive font on the glowing wall. She looked at Preston, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic as the blood drained entirely from her face. "He played you perfectly," I continued mercilessly, driving the final nail into the coffin of their perfect family alliance. "He used his legacy last name, his country club charm, and his fake prestige to completely blind you. He knew exactly how desperate you both were to be associated with white, old money wealth. You practically handed him the keys to your entire financial future because you were too obsessed with the optics of having a white tech CEO son-in-law to actually look at his balance sheets. He has been systematically draining your life savings to pay for his sports cars, his tailored clothes, and the very tropical vacations he claimed he was treating you to." Preston looked like a cornered rat trapped in a trap of his own making. The wealthy political investors who had been drinking his champagne and laughing at his jokes just moments ago were now looking at him with utter disgust. They shook their heads and literally stepped backward away from his table as if his sudden financial ruin were a highly contagious disease. Preston held up his shaking hands, sweating profusely under the harsh light of the projected screens. "Valerie Marcus. I can explain." Preston babbled, his voice high and reedy, completely stripped of its previous arrogance. "The market was experiencing a severe downturn. We had temporary liquidity issues with the development team. I was going to pay it all back with interest once the new application officially launched. It was just a bridge loan between family members to keep the business afloat." "It was theft," I corrected him sharply, my voice cutting through his pathetic lies like a knife. "And you do not even have an application in development to generate a single dollar of revenue. You are completely broke, and now, thanks to your greed, so are they." The cracks in the Sterling family alliance split wide open right there in the middle of the crowded ballroom. Valerie let out a loud, choked sob, clutching her diamond necklace as the devastating reality of her vanished retirement funds crashed down upon her shoulders. She had worshipped Preston. She had thrown her own teenage daughter away into a freezing storm to protect the pristine image that Preston was now happily dragging through the mud. I turned my gaze to my father, expecting to see the same horror. I expected Marcus to grab Preston by the collar, just like he had grabbed me 14 years ago. I expected him to demand his money back, to roar with righteous, furious indignation at the man who had robbed him blind in his own home. But Marcus did not move toward Preston. His broad chest heaved, his hands balled into tight fists, and his eyes were bloodshot and wild, but he could not bring himself to attack the golden boy. His ego was far too massive and far too fragile to admit in front of all these important politicians and business tycoons that he had been successfully conned. Acknowledging Preston and his glaring financial crimes meant acknowledging his own colossal stupidity. It meant admitting to the entire room that he had been played for an absolute fool by the very man he used to elevate his own social status. Marcus could not handle the public humiliation of being a victim. He needed a scapegoat to bear the weight of his embarrassment. He always needed a scapegoat. His face twisted into a familiar, terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He slowly turned his head away from Preston, the actual thief standing right beside him, and locked his blazing, bloodshot eyes directly onto me. Marcus stood frozen, his broad chest heaving under his tailored tuxedo. His mind was violently rejecting the absolute reality projected on the massive screens above us. To accept that Preston Vance, his hand-picked white knight of a son-in-law, was nothing but a high-class con artist meant accepting his own profound failure. It meant admitting he had traded his own flesh and blood for an illusion of prestige. So instead of confronting the parasite bleeding him dry, he aimed all of his venom at the mirror, reflecting his foolishness. He glared at me, his jaw working furiously, preparing to unleash the same self-righteous fury he had used to banish me into the freezing rain 14 years ago. He wanted to crush me, to scream that I was fabricating evidence, to demand that I be thrown out of the country club I now owned. But before Marcus could even draw a breath to scream, his golden child beat him to it. The camera lens whips away from Marcus, snapping into quick, erratic pans that follow Nia as she begins to pace frantically around the glass table. Her perfect composure was entirely shattered. The elegant poise she had spent her entire life cultivating evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, flailing child. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. She looked at the projected bank statements showcasing the millions of dollars her husband had stolen, and then looked at the crowd of Atlanta elite who were whispering and pointing at her. The realization that her luxury lifestyle was a complete fabrication was crashing down on her, but her twisted psychology refused to place the blame where it belonged. She could not attack Preston. Her entire identity was tied to being his perfect high society wife. To accept his guilt was to accept her own utter ruin. So she did what she had always done. She blamed me. "You are lying!" Nia shrieked, her voice cracking into an ugly, hysterical pitch. The erratic camera movement mirrors her spiraling panic, darting back and forth as she waves her hands wildly, her expensive jewelry clinking. "You faked these documents, Zuri. You fabricated all of this just to embarrass us. You could not stand that I married a successful man. You could not stand that I got the life you always wanted. So you paid someone to hack into these screens and display this garbage." "Nia, please," Preston muttered, trying to reach for her arm, his face dripping with nervous sweat. "Just stop talking." "Do not touch me!" Nia snapped, batting his hand away, but still refusing to direct her actual rage at him. She spun back toward me, her eyes wide and manic. Her breathing was so rapid I thought she might actually hyperventilate right there on the ballroom floor. "You are sick, Zuri!" she screamed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "You are a sick, jealous little nobody. You sneak in here wearing a nice suit, and suddenly you think you are better than us. You think you can just destroy my husband and his reputation because you are a bitter, pathetic dropout. Make them turn the screens off. Turn them off right now before I make you regret ever showing your face here." I did not move a single muscle. I did not flinch or break eye contact. I just sat there watching my younger sister completely unravel under the bright lights of the country club she falsely thought she ruled. The utter calm radiating from my side of the table only fueled her hysteria. The wealthy crowd was watching her have a full psychological breakdown, and the absolute humiliation of it pushed her over the edge. Nia lunged forward with sudden violent intent. Her hand clamped down on a heavy crystal goblet filled to the brim with expensive red wine resting on the table. With a guttural scream, she threw her arm back, ready to hurl the dark liquid directly into my face to ruin my custom suit and physically assault me in front of hundreds of witnesses. She never even got the glass past her own shoulder. From the deep shadows just behind my chair, a massive figure materialized with terrifying speed. DeAndre, my head of security, moved silently and flawlessly. He is a mountain of a man, ex-military, built like a bank vault and trained to anticipate threats before they even fully formulate. Before Nia could snap her arm forward, DeAndre stepped out and reached out, catching her wrist mid-air. His massive hand clamped around her delicate forearm like a steel vice, stopping her momentum entirely. The red wine sloshed violently inside the crystal goblet, staining her own fingers, but not a single drop reached my face. Nia froze, her eyes wide with genuine shock as she stared up at the giant man holding her arm in a grip of iron. For a split second, the entire room held its collective breath, watching the golden child get physically stopped in her tracks. Then the illusion of physical danger snapped Nia right back into her favorite role: the victim. "Let go of me!" she shrieked at the top of her lungs, dropping the wine glass. It shattered against the polished marble floor, splashing dark red stains across the pristine white tiles and her expensive designer shoes. She began to thrash and pull against DeAndre, pretending she was in agonizing pain. "He is hurting me. Assault! This is assault! Call the police! Preston, do something. He is breaking my arm." DeAndre simply released her wrist, stepping back into a professional, neutral stance directly behind my chair. He did not say a single word. He did not need to. His physical presence alone was enough to make Preston take a large, cowardly step backward, completely abandoning his wife to deal with the consequences of her own violent actions. Valerie rushed forward, throwing her arms around her weeping golden child. My mother clutched Nia to her chest, glaring at me with a hatred so pure it was practically radioactive. She stroked Nia, and her hair treating the 28-year-old woman like a battered toddler who had just been bullied on a playground. Look at what you are doing! Zuri, Valerie shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the ballroom, cutting through the whispers of the elite guests. She swept her arm outward, encompassing the shattered glass, the whispering crowd, and the damning financial documents still glowing on the walls. Are you happy now? You bring your thugs into a private club to assault your own sister. You humiliate your family in front of the entire city. You are destroying this family. You have always wanted to destroy this family. I slowly stood up from the glass table, taking my time to smooth the front of my tailored jacket. I looked down at the hem of my designer blazer. A single solitary drop of red wine had managed to splash upward from the shattered glass on the floor, landing near my cuff. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a pristine white silk handkerchief, and casually wiped the drop away. I did not rush. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to watch me dismiss their dramatic theatrics with absolute utter boredom. I tossed the stained handkerchief onto the table right over Preston and his empty cocktail glass. I didn't destroy anything, Mom. I said, my voice dangerously low, perfectly calm, and carrying clearly across the ruined silence of the gala. I'm just reading the receipts. Preston is the one who took a sledgehammer to your bank accounts. I took a step closer, my eyes locking onto Marcus, who was still standing paralyzed by his own monumental failure. But if you want to talk about destruction, I continued, projecting my voice, so every single wealthy investor in the room could hear the final nail going into the coffin. Let's talk about the second mortgage on the family mansion. The camera lens begins a slow, agonizingly smooth dolly in directly onto Marcus and his sweating face. His jaw is clenched so tightly that the muscles flutter visibly under his skin. The heavy chandeliers cast harsh shadows across the deep lines of his forehead, emphasizing the sheer panic bubbling just beneath his aristocratic facade. He swallows hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his stiff white collar. For a fraction of a second, I see the absolute terror of a man realizing he is standing on the edge of an abyss. But Marcus is a creature of pure ego. His entire existence is built on the illusion of control and superiority. He cannot allow these wealthy onlookers, these country club elites he so desperately wants to impress, to see him bleed. He forcefully adjusts his suit jacket, jutting his chin out in a pathetic display of defiance. He lets out a loud, booming scoff that sounds entirely forced, echoing unnaturally in the quiet ballroom. You really think you have me figured out? Do you not? Zuri? Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. You think you can waltz in here with a few bank statements and humiliate me? You know absolutely nothing about high-level finance. That second mortgage was a strategic liquidity maneuver. It was a calculated capital allocation. You think taking out a mortgage puts me in danger? You are just as ignorant as you were when you were a child. He turns his attention to the crowd, gesturing with his hands, trying to play the part of the seasoned patriarch educating a foolish youth. He is putting on a show, desperately trying to win back the respect of his peers. My core assets are completely insulated, Marcus boasted, his voice rising with unearned confidence. You think I would leave the Sterling estate vulnerable to market fluctuations or bad investments? The family mansion is entirely untouchable. I transferred the deed and all associated equity directly into the Sterling Family Trust years ago. It is an ironclad legal fortress. Even if Vanguard Solutions went completely bankrupt, even if every other account was drained, the estate remains protected by the very financial architecture my father built. Marcus turned back to me, a triumphant, nasty smirk spreading across his face. The sweat was still glistening on his temples, but his eyes were alive with the thrill of his own perceived brilliance. You see, Zuri, you thought you had me cornered, Marcus taunted, pointing a finger at my face. You thought you could use Preston and his bad business deals to tear me down. But Grandpa Isaiah and his money still technically protect this family. The trust shields the mansion from any creditors, any bankruptcies, and especially from any vindictive little girls trying to play corporate raider. You cannot touch the house. No one can touch the house. It belongs to the trust. I sat perfectly still, letting his triumphant words wash over me. I looked at his smug face at Valerie, who was now nodding along with a relieved sigh at Nia, who was wiping her smeared mascara, thinking her childhood bedroom was safe. I let them savor their fleeting illusion of safety for exactly 5 seconds. Then I started to laugh. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a deep, chilling laugh that bubbled up from the very bottom of my chest. It was the sound of 14 years of pain, 14 years of grinding hustle and relentless planning, finally breaking free. The sound echoed off the high walls of the ballroom, sharp and dangerous. The triumphant smirk on Marcus and his face instantly vanished, replaced by a look of profound unease. Valerie actually took a step backward, pulling Nia along with her. The wealthy guests watching the spectacle shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the trap had not yet fully snapped shut. I stopped laughing and looked dead into my father and his terrified eyes. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm whisper that carried perfectly through the microphone clipped to my lapel. The Sterling Family Trust is an ironclad legal fortress. Grandpa Isaiah built it to be completely impenetrable. But you never actually read the founding documents, did you? You just saw a tax shelter and blindly threw your most valuable asset inside, thinking it would save you from your own stupidity. I picked up my tablet from the glass table. With a single deliberate swipe, I removed Preston and his fraudulent bank statements from the massive screens projecting around the room. In their place, a towering legal document appeared. It was dense, filled with complex legal jargon, but the heavy black signatures at the bottom were unmistakable. One belonged to Grandpa Isaiah. The other belonged to a highly respected federal judge. "Grandpa Isaiah knew exactly who you were, Marcus," I explained, rising slowly from my chair and stepping around the table. "He knew you were a vain, greedy fool who would eventually squander everything he built to impress people who do not even like you. He knew you would desperately need a place to hide your assets when your terrible decisions finally caught up with you. So he created the ultimate honey trap." I pointed to the massive screen, tapping my tablet to highlight a specific, heavily worded paragraph in bright red. The camera tracks my movement, keeping Marcus and his horrified face in the background as the glowing red text illuminates his sweating features. "Isaiah did not just write you out of the primary will," I continued, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "He restructured the entire legal architecture of the Sterling Family Trust. He made it an irrevocable blind trust. And he appointed a single sole executor to take absolute control of every single asset placed inside it, the very minute she turned 25 years old." Marcus stopped breathing. His chest froze. His eyes darted wildly across the giant screen, reading the legal text over and over again, as if hoping the words would miraculously change. His jaw went completely slack. The expensive Scotch glass he had been gripping so tightly slipped from his numb fingers, shattering against the marble floor. "You didn't put the house in a protective trust, Marcus," I said, delivering the final fatal blow. "You put it in my trust. You literally signed the deed of your house over to the daughter you kicked out in the rain." The crushing weight of that sentence hung in the air, suffocating Marcus where he stood. But while my father was drowning in the realization of his own ruin, another mind in the room was frantically calculating a new angle of survival. The camera drops down, snapping into a harsh low-angle shot, looking directly up at Preston Vance. The polished golden boy facade was melting off his face like wax under a blowtorch. His expensive custom tuxedo suddenly looked a size too big for his trembling frame. He looked from Marcus, who was hyperventilating, to Valerie, who was weeping into her hands, and finally to the massive digital screens still displaying his fraudulent bank transfers. You could practically see the gears grinding behind his panicked eyes. The math was doing itself in his head. The Sterling bank accounts were empty. The family mansion was gone. Marcus was a dry well. But sitting right in front of him, sipping bourbon with absolute control, was the real source of power. Preston smoothed his lapels. He forced his erratic breathing to slow down. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and visibly swallowed his pride. He took a deliberate step away from Naya, physically putting distance between himself and his hysterical wife. He squared his shoulders and turned his attention entirely to me. "Zuri," Preston said, his voice dropping an octave as he attempted to adopt a tone of hushed professional intimacy. He stepped closer to my glass table, leaning in as if we were the only two people in the crowded ballroom. Listen to me. Let us look at this objectively. Let us look at this as business professionals. I did not say a word. I simply watched him perform. What you see on those screens. Preston continued gesturing vaguely toward the evidence of his own felonies, is just a misinterpretation of aggressive capital restructuring. Marcus is a dinosaur Zuri. You know this. He had all that equity tied up in stagnant accounts yielding absolutely nothing. I was simply liberating that capital to create dynamic growth. I was trying to modernize this family and their portfolio. He offered me a slick, desperate smile. The unmitigated audacity of the man was almost impressive. He was standing directly underneath a glowing projection of his financial crimes, and he was trying to pitch me a merger. You and I. Zuri, we understand the modern market, Preston whispered, leaning closer, his eyes wide and manic. We are visionaries. You have the capital, the raw assets, the real estate. You hold the keys to the Sterling Family Trust. I have the network, the venture capital connections, the corporate infrastructure. Vanguard Solutions is a clean slate. We could pivot. We could restructure the board. If we partner up right now, we could completely dominate the Atlanta real estate market. We could build an empire. I slowly swirled the amber liquid in my glass. And what exactly happens to your loving wife in this grand corporate merger, Preston? Preston let out a short, dismissive scoff. He waved his hand through the air as if swatting away a fly, completely ignoring the fact that Nia was standing less than 10 feet away from him. Nia, Preston sneered, his voice dripping with sudden toxic disdain. Let us be entirely honest here, Zuri. Nia is an accessory. She is a depreciating asset. She spends money she does not understand to impress people she does not even like. I only married into this family because Marcus promised me access to his capital. He promised me a war chest to build my firm. But look at them. Look at what they really are. He pointed a shaking finger at Marcus and Valerie, who were both staring at him in mute, horrified disbelief. They are broke, Zuri. Preston spat, his corporate mask slipping to reveal the ruthless, opportunistic parasite underneath. They are a sinking ship. They are dead weight. We do not need them. You and I can do great things together without these pathetic parasites dragging us down. We can cut our losses right here, right now, and walk away as partners. The silence that followed his pitch was deafening. The entire ballroom of wealthy investors, politicians, and country club elites stood frozen in absolute shock. They had just watched a man sell out his own wife and her parents in real time, trying to save his own skin by aligning with the very woman he had threatened to have arrested 2 minutes earlier. I looked past Preston, shifting my gaze to my younger sister. Nia was standing perfectly still. Her hands hung limply at her sides. The frantic, hysterical energy that had consumed her just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, shell-shocked stare. Her entire reality had just been atomized. She was the golden child. She was the perfect high society daughter who had married the perfect wealthy white tech CEO. She had built her entire identity, her entire sense of superiority upon the illusion of this pristine marriage. And her husband had just publicly announced to the entire Atlanta elite that she was nothing but a depreciating asset, a stepping stone he used to get to her father and his bank accounts. The tremor started in her hands and quickly violently spread through her entire body. You bastard, Nia screamed. The sound tore through the ballroom, raw and unhinged. She lunged forward, her manicured hands curling into claws. She threw herself at Preston, grabbing the lapels of his custom tuxedo and shoving him hard against the edge of the glass table. I gave you everything! Nia shrieked, her voice breaking into a guttural sob. I lied for you. I covered for you. I let you use my father. You told me you loved me. You told me we were building a legacy. You are nothing but a broke, pathetic liar. Preston shoved her backward, his face twisting into an ugly, vicious snarl. Get off me, you crazy witch! Preston roared, smoothing his ruined jacket. You think I actually wanted to listen to you whine about your country club rivals every single day? I endured your pathetic superficial life because your father was writing the checks. But the checks bounced, Nia. You are entirely worthless to me now. Nia screamed again, launching herself at him with closed fists. The golden couple, the pristine image of Buckhead high society, completely disintegrated right in front of the cameras. They tore into each other, screaming vicious, hateful secrets, swapping vicious insults, and airing every dirty piece of laundry they possessed. The screaming match echoed through the grand ballroom, a spectacular, violent implosion of everything Marcus and Valerie Sterling had ever cared about. I sat back in my chair, took a slow, calm sip of my bourbon, and watched the empire burn. I set the heavy crystal glass back down onto the table with a definitive thud. The time for sitting and watching was over. The grand finale required my active participation. I stepped away from the table, leaving my shattered family to tear themselves apart in the center of the room. As I moved, a slow, smooth tracking shot of reality seemed to pull backward, guiding my path. The camera of the room and its collective attention followed me as I glided elegantly through the chaos. I walked right past Nia, who was now throwing wild, open-handed slaps at Preston. I walked past Marcus, who was clutching his chest and wheezing as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of his lungs. I moved with a deadly calm that stood in stark contrast to their violent, unhinged panic. My custom-tailored suit caught the harsh glare of the projected financial documents as I approached the small, elevated stage at the front of the grand ballroom. The hired string quartet had abandoned their instruments long ago, leaving the polished wooden platform entirely empty, save for a single standing microphone. I climbed the 3 short steps, my heels clicking sharply against the wood. The sound cut through the murmurs of the crowd. I reached out and wrapped my hand around the cool metal of the microphone stand. I tapped the microphone twice. A sharp, piercing screech of feedback echoed through the massive high-definition speakers mounted around the room. The effect was instantaneous. The screaming match between Nia and Preston abruptly stopped. The furious whispers of the Atlanta elite died in their throats. Every single eye in that opulent ballroom snapped toward the stage, locking directly onto me. The silence that fell over the room was absolute, heavy with anticipation and dread. I looked out over the sea of expensive tuxedos and designer gowns. These were the power players of the city. The politicians, the venture capitalists, the old money heirs, and the new money titans. For my entire life, they had looked right through me, viewing me as the unfortunate blemish on the otherwise pristine Sterling family portrait. Tonight, I was going to force them to see me. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice projecting with a smooth, deadly calm that required no shouting. I know the entertainment this evening has been a bit unorthodox. Gala events at this particular country club usually involve silent auctions and polite applause, not the complete financial evisceration of your hosts. But since we have already shattered the illusion of polite society, I believe it is time we properly clear the air. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the faces of the wealthy investors standing near the front. They were watching me with a mixture of horror and predatory fascination. They respected one thing and one thing only: absolute power. For those of you who only know me as the outcast daughter, the dropout that Marcus Sterling banished from his perfect home 14 years ago, allow me to formally introduce myself, I said, standing perfectly straight. My name is Zuri, and as of this morning, I am the sole acting Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Heritage Holdings and the singular executor of the Sterling Family Trust. I own the ground you are standing on. I own the walls projecting these documents. And more importantly, I own every single asset Marcus Sterling has falsely claimed as his own for the last decade. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I saw several prominent bankers exchange wide-eyed, panicked glances. The power dynamic in the room flipped so violently you could practically feel the air pressure change. I was no longer the tragic backstory of a wealthy family. I was the apex predator in the room. I turned my attention away from the general crowd and locked my eyes directly onto a specific group of men standing near the bar. I recognized them immediately. They were the venture capitalists Preston had been aggressively courting all evening. Now I want to address a very specific group of people in this room. I continued my tone, sharpening into a lethal corporate edge. I see Mr. Kensington from Apex Capital. I see Senator Hayes. I see the board members of the Vanguard Investment Group. You gentlemen have been drinking Preston Vance and his expensive champagne all night. You have been listening to his pitch for a revolutionary new software application. And more importantly, I know for a fact that several of you have recently signed preliminary contracts to inject massive funding into his hollow shell of a company. Preston let out a choked, strangled noise from the center of the room. He took a stumbling step toward the stage, holding his hands out in a pathetic begging gesture. Zuri, please, he begged, his voice cracking. Do not do this. We can handle this privately. This is family business. This stopped being family business the second you stole from my mother's retirement account to buy your tailored suits. Preston? I fired back, my voice echoing with icy authority. I looked right back at the investors. Gentlemen, Preston Vance assured you that his startup was risk-free. He assured you that your massive investments were fully backed and secured by the Sterling family fortune. He used the Sterling estate, the mansion, the liquid accounts, and the corporate holding firm as collateral for your capital. He promised you that if his software failed, my father's assets would cover your losses. I leaned into the microphone, a cold, victorious smile touching the corners of my mouth. But as you have just witnessed, Marcus Sterling does not own those assets, I revealed, enunciating every single word so the reality of the situation would sink deep into their bones. He has not owned them for a very long time. Preston Vance used collateral that did not belong to him. He pledged assets that are legally locked inside an irrevocable blind trust. A trust that I solely control, which means every single contract you signed with him, every guarantee of security, every promise of collateral is completely legally void. He did not secure your investments, gentlemen. He sold you thin air. He committed wire fraud on a massive scale, and he used your money to fund his luxury lifestyle. If you give him another dime, you are not investing in a tech company. You are funding a criminal enterprise. The reaction was immediate and absolutely devastating. The hook set in deep tearing through the faux elite mask Preston had worn for years. The wealthy power players did not hesitate for a single second. The men in the tailored suits, the venture capitalists, and the political backers all moved in sudden chaotic unison. They immediately stood up from their tables, turning their backs on Preston as if he were covered in a highly contagious disease. Hands plunged into expensive jacket pockets, pulling out smartphones. Screens illuminated the dim edges of the ballroom as the elites scrambled to save themselves. I could hear the urgent, frantic whispers echoing from the back of the room. Call the bank, freeze the transfer immediately, halt all funds going to Vanguard Solutions, get the legal team on the phone right now. Preston Vance was officially ruined in the business world. He was branded a toxic asset, a fraudster who had tried to con the most powerful people in Atlanta. He stood frozen in the center of the wreckage, watching the men he worshipped actively dismantle his entire future. He had nothing left. No money, no prestige, no company, and no future. The venture capitalists pushed past Preston, their faces frozen into masks of pure self-preservation. Phones were pressed tightly to ears as frantic voices commanded wealth managers to halt all wire transfers immediately. Preston stood paralyzed in the center of the mass exodus, a hollow statue of a man who had just watched his entire fake empire evaporate into thin air. He was completely broken. But as the chaotic noise of wealthy men saving their fortunes echoed through the grand ballroom, my mother saw her opening. Valerie Sterling had spent her entire adult life curating an image of absolute maternal perfection. She was a pillar of Buckhead society, the flawless matriarch who hosted charity galas and smiled benignly for the cameras. Now, with her husband facing total financial ruin and her golden son-in-law exposed as a common criminal, the pristine walls of her kingdom were collapsing. She realized with terrifying clarity that I held the keys to her survival. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that her only remaining currency was biological guilt. She stepped away from Nia, who was still glaring venomously at Preston, and moved toward the center of the shattered glass. Looking down from the stage, I watched her shrink herself. She purposefully looked small and diminished under the harsh, glaring lights of the projected financial documents. She clasped her diamond-ringed hands over her chest, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated anguish. The tears came instantly, a practiced mechanism she had perfected over decades of manipulation. Valerie looked out at the remaining guests, the country club elites who were watching this spectacular implosion. "Please," she cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak. "Please, you all have to understand. Raising a child is so incredibly difficult." She let out a ragged sob, pressing a hand to her forehead, as if overwhelmed by the tragic burden of motherhood. She was playing her ultimate card. She was weaponizing her identity, leaning heavily into the trope of the long-suffering black mother to garner sympathy from the conservative elite crowd. Zuri was a troubled child. Valerie wept, turning her face so the most prominent guests could see her tears. She was angry, defiant, always fighting against the love we tried to give her. We did our best. God knows we did our absolute best to save her from herself. We gave her a beautiful home. We gave her the best education. But she wanted to destroy us. She ran away because she could not handle the discipline and the boundaries of a loving family. She paced a few steps, playing directly to the sympathies of the wealthy parents in the room, appealing to their shared expectations of respectability. She painted herself as the tragic victim who had sacrificed everything for a deeply ungrateful and vindictive daughter. Then she turned her tear-streaked face up toward the stage, locking her wet, desperate eyes onto mine. "Zuri, my baby!" Valerie cried, reaching her hands out toward the stage. Her voice cracked, echoing loudly through the silent, captivated ballroom. "I know you are hurt. I know you felt misunderstood when you were younger. But to do this to us, to humiliate your father and your sister in front of all our friends. You have made your point. You have your money. Now please stop this madness. I am your mother. I carried you. I gave you life. You owe me grace." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I stood at the microphone and watched her perform this masterful, manipulative theater. 14 years ago, those tears might have worked. 14 years ago, I might have fallen to my knees and begged for the affection she was currently faking for an audience. But the terrified, desperate teenager she had allowed to be thrown into the freezing rain was dead. I had buried her myself. I slowly turned away from the microphone. The heavy silence in the ballroom amplified the sharp, deliberate clicking of my heels as I descended the 3 wooden steps from the stage. The crowd of elite guests instinctively parted, stepping back to clear a wide path as I walked purposefully across the marble floor. I moved with absolute terrifying calm. I did not rush. I walked straight through the wreckage of the evening, past the shattered crystal and the spilled red wine, until I was standing directly in front of Valerie. I stopped mere inches from her face. From this close, I could see the panic hiding just behind her perfectly calculated tears. I could see the rapid pulse beating in her throat. Her breath hitched as she looked up at me, waiting for the forgiveness she thought her biological title automatically guaranteed her. She expected me to break. She expected me to bow to the sacred altar of motherhood, to fold under the public pressure of a mother begging her child for mercy. I looked down at the woman who had watched her husband throw me out into a violent storm without lifting a single finger to stop him. The woman who had packed my belongings into trash bags and completely erased my existence from her perfect life. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that was meant only for her, yet carried the weight of absolute finality. "You gave me life, but Grandpa Isaiah gave me survival. You lost the right to be my mother the second you let him drag me into the storm." I did not wait for her to process the devastation of those words. I immediately stood tall, breaking eye contact with her shattered expression. Without looking back, I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once, signaling DeAndre to bring in the final paperwork. DeAndre stepped forward from the shadows of the stage, moving with the silent, terrifying precision of a military operative. But he did not hand me a stack of legal papers. Instead, he handed me a sleek black digital tablet directly wired into the ballroom primary audiovisual server. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room had already been locked and secured by my security team. No one was leaving this room until I was completely satisfied. I took the tablet, holding it up so the glowing screen caught the dim ambient light of the ballroom. The camera snaps into a fast tracking shot, whipping back and forth between my cold, impassive face and Nia. Her eyes widened into massive white saucers. She stopped breathing. She recognized the tablet. She recognized the implications of what was about to happen. The tracking shot pushes in tight on her terrified expression as all the blood drains from her perfectly contoured face. My mother just stood here and spun a beautiful, tragic tale about a troubled child. I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal resonance over the microphone. She told you I ran away. She told you I was a thief. She played the role of the martyred matriarch so perfectly, you almost have to respect the sheer sociopathic dedication to the craft. I began to slowly pace the width of the stage. The eyes of the Atlanta elite followed me, mesmerized by the impending execution. 14 years ago, $5,000 went missing from the Sterling Family Charity Fund. I explained, locking eyes with the wealthiest women in the room, the same women who had just been nodding in sympathy at Valerie. The cash was found stuffed into the bottom of my school backpack. I was 16 years old. I stood in the foyer of that massive mansion, and I begged my parents to believe me. I screamed until my throat bled, swearing I had no idea how the money got there. They did not listen. Marcus dragged me by my hair and threw me out into a freezing thunderstorm with nothing but the clothes on my back. They told everyone I was a thief. They told everyone I was a lost cause. I stopped pacing and turned my attention back to Nia. The fast tracking shot whips between us again, capturing the sheer panic radiating from her trembling body. She took a step backward, shaking her head in silent, frantic denial. Zuri no Nia mouthed, her voice completely failing her. Please do not. But the thing about the truth, I continued tapping the screen of the tablet, is that it never actually dies. It just waits for someone with enough capital to dig it back up. My private investigators are exceptionally thorough. They do not just track offshore bank accounts. They track people. They track old grudges. They track former sorority sisters and bitter country club rivals who have a habit of recording conversations for future blackmail. I pressed a single button on the tablet. The massive high-definition speakers mounted in all four corners of the ballroom hummed to life. The crisp, digitally enhanced audio crackled through the air. The sound of clinking champagne glasses and loud pulsing club music echoed over the speakers, immediately painting the picture of a VIP nightclub booth. Then, Nia spoke. Her recorded voice was younger, slightly slurred by alcohol, but dripping with unmistakable arrogant malice. It echoed through the dead silent ballroom, loud enough to rattle the crystal chandeliers. Oh, please, Zuri was a total freak. Nia laughed on the recording, her voice dripping with toxic privileged disdain. You know I took that $5,000 for my spring break trip to Cabo. I literally stuffed the cash envelope into her ratty backpack while she was studying for some stupid chemistry test. I set her up perfectly. A collective horrified gasp swept through the crowd, but the recording was not finished. The best part, Nia continued on the tape, her laughter turning cruel and sharp. Mom and Dad totally knew it was me. They found my shopping receipts 3 days later, but they did not care. They never said a word. They just wanted an excuse to get rid of the weird kid anyway. It was a complete win-win. I tapped the screen, stopping the audio. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. The recording had just detonated like a nuclear bomb in the center of the room, completely vaporizing the last remaining shreds of the Sterling family dignity. Valerie Sterling collapsed. Her knees physically gave out underneath her, and she grabbed the edge of a banquet table, sending silverware crashing to the floor as she slumped into a chair. Her flawless matriarch facade was gone, replaced by the pathetic trembling shell of an exposed monster. The society women who had just been weeping for her pain now looked at her with unvarnished, absolute disgust. They physically took steps away from her, pulling their designer gowns tight against their bodies, as if Valerie were covered in raw sewage. They were ruthless, cutthroat business people, but there were lines even monsters did not cross. Throwing your innocent child onto the streets to cover for a spoiled thief was a stain that could never be washed out. I looked at Marcus. The great titan of Atlanta real estate looked like a deflated balloon. His skin had turned a sickening shade of gray. His eyes darted around the room seeking a single friendly face, a single ally in the crowd. But there was no one. The bankers, the politicians, the venture capitalists, they were glaring at him with pure, unadulterated contempt. He was not just broke. He was a coward. He was a man who had sacrificed his own daughter to protect an illusion. The pressure of their collective disgust was too much. The public humiliation was a physical weight crushing him into the floor. He could not take it. He could not stand there and face the consequences of a lifetime of arrogance and cruelty. Marcus Sterling turned his back on his weeping wife, his hysterical daughter, and his ruined son-in-law. He dropped his expensive bourbon glass, letting it shatter against the marble, and he bolted. He moved with a desperate, pathetic scurry, heading straight for the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the ballroom. He just wanted to escape the glaring lights and the staring eyes. He reached out to push the brass handles open. DeAndre stepped out of the shadows, moving with terrifying, unnatural speed. He planted his massive frame directly in front of the exit, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle and custom-tailored suit. He crossed his arms over his chest, staring down at Marcus with cold, dead eyes. Marcus slammed into him and bounced off, stumbling backward in shock. I leaned closer to the microphone, my voice slicing through the air like a razor blade. "We aren't finished." DeAndre moved from his position, blocking the heavy mahogany doors. He walked with the precise, calculated steps of an executioner approaching the block. The massive ballroom remained completely silent as he crossed the marble floor, carrying a sleek black leather folio. He bypassed the terrified venture capitalists. He walked right past Nia, who was staring blankly at the floor. He ignored Valerie, who was still putting on a pathetic display of weeping in her chair. DeAndre stopped directly in front of the glass table where Marcus was now standing trapped and hyperventilating. The camera pushes in for a tight, extreme close-up shot tracking the crisp, white legal documents as DeAndre slides them smoothly across the polished glass table. The heavy parchment comes to a dead stop, directly under the harsh glowing light of the projected financial records. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to the table, standing directly across from my father. "Look at them, Marcus," I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy air. "Read the documents." Marcus stared down at the papers as if they were venomous snakes ready to strike. He reached out with a trembling hand, pulling the first page toward him. His eyes scanned the dense legal jargon and the complex financial figures. I watched the last remaining drops of blood drain entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out corpse. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The reality of his situation was finally crashing down upon him with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. "You thought you were a titan," I said, leaning slightly over the table. "You thought you were the smartest man in Atlanta. But you were just an arrogant man playing a dangerous game with money you never truly understood and assets you never legally owned." I turned my attention to the remaining members of the high society crowd. They were hanging on to every single word, fascinated by the spectacular destruction of one of their own. For the past 5 years, Marcus Sterling has been quietly taking out massive shadow loans. I explained to the room, ensuring my voice projected clearly. He went to private equity firms. He went to aggressive lenders who operate just outside the boundaries of traditional banking. He needed cash to cover his failing investments and to maintain the illusion of his immense wealth. To secure those massive loans, he used the Buckhead estate, the corporate headquarters, and the family vacation properties in Aspen as collateral. I looked back down at Marcus, who was gripping the edge of the glass table so hard his knuckles were completely white. "But there was a fatal flaw in your grand financial strategy, Marcus," I whispered, staring directly into his panicked eyes. "You signed sworn legal affidavits claiming sole ownership of those properties. You pledged them as your own personal assets, but you never owned them. The irrevocable blind trust owned them. I own them. A collective murmur of absolute shock rolled through the elite crowd. They were ruthless business people, and they understood exactly what those words meant. The implications were catastrophic. That is not just bad business, Marcus. I continued, my tone dropping to a cold, lethal register. That is bank fraud. That is wire fraud. That is grand larceny on a federal scale. You lied to financial institutions and secured tens of millions of dollars using collateral that you had absolutely no legal right to touch. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His throat was completely dry. He looked around the room, his eyes darting frantically from face to face. He was searching for a lifeline. He was looking for one of his powerful golfing buddies, one of his political allies, or one of the bankers he had dined with for decades. But the room had turned entirely cold. The men and women he had desperately tried to impress his entire life were turning their backs on him. They were already texting their own legal teams, severing all ties and ensuring their own names were scrubbed from any association with Sterling Heritage Holdings. He was a complete pariah. You are looking at a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary, Marcus, I stated, laying out the absolute finality of his ruin. The SEC, the IRS, and the FBI will completely dismantle whatever is left of your life. They will freeze your personal accounts. They will seize Valerie's jewelry. They will auction off everything you ever claimed to love. You will die in a concrete cell wearing a jumpsuit. Marcus let out a pathetic whimpering sound. The great patriarch of the Sterling family was utterly broken, reduced to a terrified shell of a man staring into the abyss of his own making. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit and pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen. The metal glinted under the ballroom lights as I placed it gently on top of the legal documents. I am offering you a singular chance at mercy, I said, my voice perfectly steady. It is something you never once offered me when you threw me out into the rain, but I am a better businesswoman than you ever were. I do not need you in a prison cell to win. I just need you completely erased from my empire. I tapped the silver pen with my index finger. Sign the confession, Marcus. Admit to the fraud, hand over the remaining 5% of the minor assets, and I will not send the FBI to your door. The silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. The only sound was the jagged, frantic breathing of the man who had ruined my childhood. Marcus looked down at the pen. He looked at Valerie, who was still weeping pathetically into her hands, completely useless and paralyzed by her own exposed guilt. He looked at Nia, who was staring at him with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that her father was not a savior, but a criminal. He had no moves left to play. He had no leverage, no money, no allies, and no power. The empire was gone. I watched his hands. They were trembling violently. The tremor started in his fingers and quickly spread up his arms, shaking his entire body. It was a visceral, uncontrollable physical reaction to total panic. I remembered that exact tremor. 14 years ago, standing in a sterile white hospital room while a heart monitor beeped steadily in the background, I had watched him shake just like this. He had trembled with rage and fear when he realized his precious reputation was in jeopardy because of me. He had shaken with absolute fury right before he decided to sacrifice his own daughter to save his public image. Now he was shaking because the illusion was dead. The karma was absolute and poetic. Marcus, physically shaking exactly like he did in the hospital 14 years ago, picks up the pen. The nib of the silver fountain pen touched the thick parchment. The ink flowed dark and permanent. Marcus dragged his trembling hand across the signature line, sealing his own total defeat. He did not read the stipulations. He did not attempt to negotiate a better deal. He just surrendered. The great patriarch surrendered his kingdom, his pride, and his legacy to the daughter he had discarded like trash. He dropped the pen. It clattered against the glass table, sounding louder than a gunshot in the silent room. He slumped forward, resting his heavy head in his hands, a broken king without a castle. Watching Marcus sign away the empire was the final psychological break for Preston Vance. The math finally finalized in his parasitic brain. If Marcus surrendered the assets, then the Sterling family was destitute. If the Sterling family was destitute, then Nia was destitute. If Nia was destitute, there was no divorce settlement. There was no golden parachute to soften his landing. There was no venture capital firm. Preston was left holding a massive bag of debt and impending federal wire fraud charges with absolutely zero collateral to leverage. His entire existence, his carefully curated life of country clubs, tailored suits, and imported cars, had just been zeroed out with the simple stroke of a silver pen. The realization hit him like a speeding freight train. The handheld camera jerks forward, snapping into a frantic kinetic movement as it closely follows Preston. He let out a visceral, guttural roar that sounded more animal than human. The polished tech bro facade completely shattered, revealing the desperate, violent coward hiding beneath the expensive fabric. He shoved past Nia, sending her stumbling backward into a waiter. He charged directly toward the stage, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his fists balled tightly at his sides. The camera shakes, capturing the blur of terrified guests, scattering out of his warpath, holding up their hands to shield themselves from his explosive, unpredictable rage. "You black bitch, I will ruin you!" Preston screamed, the ugly racial slur tearing through the elegant ballroom like a physical weapon. His voice was raw, tearing his vocal cords as he lunged toward me. The wealthy elites gasped, stepping back in horror as the true nature of their former golden boy was laid bare. DeAndre shifted his weight, his massive frame tensing to intercept the threat. His muscles coiled, ready to drop Preston to the floor before he could even reach the first step of the stage. But I raised my hand in a sharp, swift motion, ordering DeAndre to stand down. I did not need a bodyguard to handle a man who was already falling apart. I wanted to look him in the eye as he destroyed himself. I stood my ground, waiting until the absolute final fraction of a second. Preston launched his body forward, aiming a wild, desperate swing directly at my face, putting all his weight and momentum into a strike meant to shatter my jaw. I simply pivoted on my heel, taking one smooth, calculated step to the right. Preston swung at empty air. The sheer momentum of his blind rage carried his heavy frame forward past the edge of the stage. His leather shoe caught the heavy brass leg of a banquet chair. He tripped, his arms flailing wildly as gravity took complete control of his body. He launched headfirst into the magnificent centerpiece of the ballroom, a massive 10-tier champagne tower that had been meticulously constructed for the gala. The sound of hundreds of crystal glasses shattering simultaneously echoed like a bomb detonating in the enclosed space. A tidal wave of expensive vintage champagne crashed down over him, completely soaking his custom tuxedo. He hit the marble floor hard, slipping and sliding in the massive puddle of alcohol and shattered crystal. The heavy base of the tower toppled over, striking him squarely in the back and pinning him to the ground. He groaned, rolling onto his back and struggling to sit up. Shards of broken glass clung to his blonde hair and his ruined jacket. He looked entirely pathetic, a wet, thrashing mess of a man bleeding from a small, shallow cut on his cheek and smelling heavily of a cheap dive bar. The elite guests of Atlanta stared down at him in absolute, unvarnished disgust. The men who had been shaking his hand an hour ago now looked at him like he was a rabid animal that needed to be put down. The women covered their mouths, whispering harshly to their husbands. The golden boy of Buckhead was literally rolling in the garbage. I looked down at him from the edge of the stage, brushing a single stray drop of champagne from the pristine sleeve of my suit. "You ruined yourself, Preston," I said, my voice cold, flat, and loud enough for the entire room to hear clearly. "And you did it for absolutely free." Preston opened his mouth to spit another vile insult, but before he could even attempt to scrape his ruined body off the wet floor, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom swung violently open. They hit the walls with a loud, authoritative crack, snapping everyone's attention toward the main entrance. 6 uniformed officers from the Atlanta Police Department marched into the room, flanked by 2 federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers. The flashing red and blue lights from their cruisers outside cast an eerie, chaotic glow through the massive front windows, illuminating the shocked faces of the country club elites. For a split second, Valerie gasped loudly, clutching her chest, thinking the authorities had come for Marcus. Naya scrambled backwards, slipping on the spilled wine and pressing herself flat against the nearest wall, trying to disappear into the floral wallpaper. Marcus did not even look up, keeping his head buried in his hands, entirely resigned to whatever fate awaited him. But the officers did not even look at the sterling patriarch. They marched straight through the parted crowd, stepping over the spilled wine, and stopped directly in front of the shattered champagne tower. The guests moved back, giving the police a wide berth. Preston Vance, the lead federal agent, barked, his voice booming with undeniable, rigid authority. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud." Preston stared up at them from his puddle of broken glass, his mouth hanging open in sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked frantically toward the bar area where the wealthy investors had been standing just moments ago. The men he had tried to con, the powerful venture capitalists I had just enlightened, had wasted absolutely no time. They had made their phone calls immediately, leveraging their massive political and legal connections to dispatch federal agents directly to the gala. They were not just freezing their funds, they were actively seeking vengeance for the attempted theft. Preston raised his bleeding hands, holding them out toward the officers in a pathetic gesture of surrender. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent ballroom, locking his wrists together behind his back. The Empire was officially dead. The heavy steel cuffs clicked shut, echoing with terrifying finality over the quiet murmurs of the stunned ballroom. The two federal agents hauled Preston to his feet, dragging his soaked, ruined body up from the puddle of expensive champagne and shattered crystal. Preston thrashed wildly, slipping on the wet marble as he desperately tried to look back at the crowd. He screamed for Marcus. He screamed for the venture capitalists, who were already aggressively turning their backs and pretending he did not exist. Finally, he locked his panicked, bloodshot eyes on his wife. He begged Nia to call their lawyers. He pleaded with her to fix it, to dip into her personal trust, to post his bail. But Nia just took another slow step backward, physically pressing her spine against the floral wallpaper. She looked at the man she had married, the man who was supposed to guarantee her lifelong status as Buckhead royalty, and she offered him absolutely nothing. She disowned him in a fraction of a second, her survival instincts overriding any illusion of marital loyalty. She watched with cold, wide eyes as the agents dragged her screaming husband out through the mahogany doors, letting them swing shut and severing him from her life forever. But as the doors closed, the brutal reality of the situation rapidly descended upon the golden child. Nia looked toward the center of the room. Marcus was still slumped over the glass table, staring blankly at the signed confession that stripped him of the entire sterling empire. Valerie was still weeping in her chair, clutching a diamond necklace that the IRS would likely seize before the end of the fiscal quarter. The venture capitalists and country club elites were already whispering frantically to their fixers, scrambling to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Sterling family fraud. Nia realized with suffocating absolute terror that her life raft was gone. Preston was headed to federal prison. Her father was completely bankrupt and facing his own devastating legal ruin. The sprawling mansion she lived in, the offshore accounts she drew from the black cards she swiped effortlessly every single day, were all legally tied to a fraudulent empire that I now owned entirely. She had nothing. She was a 30-year-old woman with no job, no actual skills, and zero liquid assets. Her high society friends, the women who had kissed her cheek and praised her designer gowns just an hour ago, were currently glaring at her with unveiled contempt. In the span of 5 minutes, the untouchable princess of Atlanta had been reduced to a destitute pariah. Nia slowly turned her head and looked directly at me. I was standing at the edge of the stage, flanked by DeAndre, radiating an immovable, absolute authority. I held the deeds. I held the bank accounts. I held her entire future in the palm of my hand. The panic finally broke through her pristine facade. Her breathing turned jagged and shallow. She stumbled forward, her designer heels slipping dangerously on the champagne-soaked marble floor. She abandoned all remaining shreds of her carefully curated dignity, pushing past the staring society wives as she scrambled toward the stage. She looked pathetic, a frantic, desperate animal cornered by the consequences of her own malice. She reached the edge of the stage and her knees physically gave out. The camera drops into a sharp, low-angle shot looking up at me from the floor as Nia completely collapses. She drops hard onto her knees, the impact echoing sharply against the marble. She reaches out with trembling, frantic hands and grabs a fistful of my bespoke couture dress, clinging to the expensive fabric as if it were the edge of a cliff. The contrast between us was stark and absolute. I stood tall, immaculate, and perfectly composed, my posture radiating icy, unyielding control. Nia knelt in the spilled alcohol and broken glass, her expensive gown stained and ruined. Dark, thick streaks of mascara ran down her perfectly contoured face, mixing with her frantic tears. The golden child was literally sobbing at my feet, begging the sister she had thrown away. "Please, sis." Nia wept, her voice breaking into a hysterical, pathetic wail. "Please, we are blood. I am sorry. I am so sorry for what I did. I will do anything. You have to help me. I have nowhere to go." I did not move a single muscle. I looked down at her hands gripping my dress. 14 years ago, I had been the one on the floor. 14 years ago, while the thunderstorm raged outside the mansion windows, I had dropped to my knees and grabbed the hem of Nia's expensive cashmere sweater. I had begged her to tell Marcus the truth. I had pleaded with her through choking sobs to admit she stole the charity money so I would not be thrown out into the freezing night. She had looked down at me with pure disgust, kicked my hands away, and told me I was pathetic. I slowly reached down and clamped my fingers around her wrists. My grip was like a steel vice. I peeled her trembling hands off my dress, forcefully breaking her desperate hold. I took a deliberate step back, breaking physical contact and forcing her to look up at me from the floor. "Blood," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal resonance that projected clearly over the silent, captivated ballroom. "You want to talk about blood now, Nia? You did not care about blood when you stuffed that stolen cash into my backpack. You did not care about blood when you stood by the grand staircase and watched your father drag me out into a violent storm. You watched me cry. You watched me beg for my life, and you just smiled." Nia shook her head violently, sobbing so hard she could barely form words. "I was just a kid," she choked out, her chest heaving. "I was scared. I did not know what else to do. Please, Zuri, the accounts are frozen. Preston is gone. They will take the house. I have absolutely nothing left. Let me stay in the guest house. I will work for you. I will make a public apology to the press. Just do not put me on the street." I looked down at the sobbing mess of a woman who had built her entire luxurious existence on my suffering. She was not sorry for what she had done to me. She was only sorry that the shield of her father's wealth had finally been shattered. She was begging because she lacked the basic survival skills she had forced me to develop when she threw me to the wolves. She wanted mercy from the very person she had tried to destroy. I leaned down, closing the distance between us until my face was merely inches from hers. I could smell the stale champagne and the sharp metallic scent of her absolute terror. I locked my eyes onto hers, ensuring she could see the cold, dead void where my sisterly affection used to be. "Get out," I whispered, echoing the exact lethal words she had spat at me 14 years ago. "I don't need a sick sister." The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind the federal agents, pulling the final seal on Preston Vance's fate. The flashing red and blue lights slowly faded from the tall arched windows, leaving the grand ballroom bathed in a cold, harsh stillness. The camera pulls back into a massive wide shot of the devastated hall. The Atlanta elite had vanished entirely. They had fled the sinking ship with terrifying speed, leaving behind a wasteland of shattered crystal, discarded silk napkins, and pools of expensive vintage champagne. Only my private security team and the absolute wreckage of the Sterling family remained in the cavernous room. Nia stayed frozen on the marble floor. Her hands were empty. Her future was entirely gone. She did not scream or fight. The realization that she was utterly powerless completely broke her. She slowly pushed herself up her ruined designer gown, dripping with alcohol, and stumbled backward. She looked at our parents, seeking some final shred of comfort, but they did not even look at her. They were too consumed by their own impending doom. Nia turned and walked toward the exit, a solitary hollow figure, stepping over the broken glass of her husband's ruined champagne tower. The heavy doors swallowed her, leaving only Marcus and Valerie. I turned my attention to the head table. Marcus was still sitting in his chair, but his posture had collapsed. He looked 20 years older. The arrogant titan of Buckhead real estate was dead. Valerie sat beside him, her diamond necklace suddenly looking like a heavy, restrictive chain around her throat. She was clutching her silk evening bag as if it were a life preserver. I stepped down from the stage, my heels clicking loudly against the marble. The sound echoed through the massive empty space, sounding like the ticking of a doomsday clock. DeAndre flanked me, a silent, immovable shadow, ensuring absolute safety. I stopped directly in front of the table, looking down at the two people who had brought me into this world, only to treat me like an infected wound. The contrast between us was visually striking. I stood in pristine, bespoke couture, untouched by the chaos, while they sat surrounded by the physical manifestation of their ruined lives. The Buckhead estate legally transfers to my holding company at midnight, I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the empty hall. My security team will be waiting at the front gates tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock. You have 24 hours to pack. Valerie blinked, her eyes wide and bloodshot. Pack, she repeated, her voice a fragile, raspy whisper. You are permitted 2 standard-size suitcases each. I continued, laying out the terms with clinical precision. You will take only your basic clothing and personal toiletries. You will leave the cars, the artwork, the silver, and the jewelry. Every single asset in that house was purchased with fraudulent funds, leveraging properties you did not legally own. If you attempt to remove a single piece of valuable property, I will consider it theft, and I will personally hand the security footage over to the federal prosecutors currently dissecting your son-in-law. Valerie let out a shrill, panicked gasp. Her manicured hands flew to her face, her practiced composure completely dissolving into genuine hysterical terror. She looked at me as if I had just ordered her execution. 2 suitcases, she shrieked, her voice cracking wildly. Zuri, you cannot be serious. That is my home. I built that house. I decorated every single room. I am Valerie Sterling. I am on the board of the Botanical Society. I host the Winter Gala every single year. You cannot simply throw us onto the streets like common vagrants. Where are we supposed to go? What are we supposed to do? I am a society woman, Zuri. I cannot live in a shelter. I glanced at Marcus, expecting him to rise to his wife's defense, to roar, and command the room the way he had done my entire life. But Marcus said absolutely nothing. He just stared blankly at the signed confession resting on the glass table. He knew the law. He knew the terms he had just agreed to in order to avoid dying in a federal prison. He knew I had outplayed, outsmarted, and completely destroyed his entire existence. He was a beaten dog. He offered Valerie no comfort, no plan, and no reassurance. Valerie reached across the table, her hands trembling violently. She tried to grab my arm, but DeAndre instantly stepped forward, his sheer presence forcing her to pull back in fear. She began to hyperventilate, the reality of severe poverty crashing into her privileged mind. "You are my daughter!" she wailed, tears ruining her expensive makeup and dripping onto her silk collar. "You have millions. You have an empire. You can afford to give us a small apartment, a condo, anything. Please, Zuri, you cannot leave us with absolutely nothing. We have no cash. The accounts are completely frozen. How are we even supposed to leave this building tonight?" I looked at the woman who had watched me beg for my life in a freezing thunderstorm. I looked at the mother who had meticulously packed my belongings into black trash bags and erased my existence to protect a lie. She was begging for the exact same mercy she had ruthlessly denied me 14 years ago. I reached into the inner pocket of my custom-tailored jacket. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not pull out a key to a luxury condo. I pulled out a single crisp $20 bill. I dropped it onto the glass table. It fluttered down, landing directly on top of Marcus's signature on the fraud confession. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the edge of the table, and looked my mother dead in the eye. "Take an Uber to a motel," I whispered, my voice entirely devoid of mercy. "Try to plan better." The morning sun breached the dense tree line of Buckhead, casting long, sharp shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of the Sterling estate. A sweeping drone shot glides high above the massive property, capturing the sheer, breathtaking scale of the compound. The camera slowly descends, dropping smoothly to ground level, just as a synchronized fleet of 4 matte black SUVs turns onto the long circular driveway. The heavy reinforced tires crunch loudly against the pristine gravel, stopping in perfect geometric formation precisely at 8 o'clock. I stepped out of the lead vehicle. The crisp morning air hit my face, but I felt absolutely nothing but cold, methodical resolve. I wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, my heels clicking rhythmically against the expensive stone pavers as I walked toward the towering grand entrance. DeAndre flanked my right side, his physical presence serving as a silent, heavy threat. A dozen members of my private security detail fanned out instantly, securing the perimeter and blocking the driveway to prevent any unauthorized exits. Sitting on the bottom step of the grand portico was Nia. She had not changed her clothes. The bespoke designer gown she wore the night before was torn at the hem and stiff with dried champagne. Her bare feet were tucked underneath her body, her expensive heels abandoned somewhere in the wet grass. She stared blankly at the massive oak front doors, entirely catatonic. Her eyes were swollen and vacant, stripped of the arrogant light that had defined her entire existence. She did not even blink as my security team marched past her boots, hitting the steps in heavy synchronization. The golden child was entirely broken, her mind completely unable to process the absolute evaporation of her privilege. I walked right past her without breaking my stride or offering a single glance of pity. DeAndre pushed the heavy double doors open, and the sound of bitter, venomous shouting immediately spilled out into the grand foyer. The entryway, usually a pristine museum of quiet luxury, was a disastrous, chaotic war zone of discarded clothes, overturned velvet boxes, and sheer, unrestrained panic. Marcus and Valerie were standing in the center of the formal living room, violently tearing their own marriage apart. Valerie was attempting to shove a massive pile of designer shoes into a standard-sized leather suitcase, weeping hysterically as the zipper refused to close. Marcus was pacing the room frantically, gathering disorganized stacks of financial documents and throwing them recklessly into his own luggage. "This is your fault, Marcus," Valerie screamed, hurling a velvet pump across the room. It shattered a crystal vase on a mahogany side table. "You told me the shadow loans were secure. You told me the properties were untouchable. I am going to be sleeping in a cheap roadside motel because you were too arrogant to realize your own daughter was outsmarting you." Marcus spun around, his face purple with absolute raging fury. "Do not you dare act like a victim, Valerie," he roared, stepping aggressively toward her. "You spent millions renovating this house. You demanded the Aspen trips and the private jets. You threw away $100,000 a month just to keep up with society women who secretly hate you. We are drowning because of your relentless, pathetic vanity." I stepped into the threshold of the living room, letting my presence drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "You are both equally responsible for your own destruction," I stated, my voice cutting through their vicious argument like a surgical blade. The time for pointing fingers expired at midnight. "It is precisely 8 o'clock. Your 24 hours are officially up." Valerie froze, dropping a handful of silk blouses onto the imported rug. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate terror. "Zuri, please," she begged, her voice shrinking into a pathetic, undignified whine. "2 suitcases is not enough. I have custom gowns. I have winter coats. I need my specialized skincare. I cannot fit my life into a standard bag. I will literally have nothing to wear." "Then you should have packed lighter," I replied, crossing my arms over my chest and staring her down. The terms were explicit and non-negotiable. 2 suitcases, each containing basic clothing and personal toiletries. Everything else, the antique furniture, the electronics, the designer wardrobes, and the jewelry, belongs to the trust. My trust. I snapped my fingers and 3 security guards stepped into the room, spreading out to monitor the luggage. "Check the bags," I ordered. Valerie sobbed violently as a guard unzipped her suitcase, callously tossing aside a hidden jewelry box containing diamond earrings she had attempted to smuggle. The velvet box hit the floor, popping open to reveal the glittering gems she no longer owned. She wailed, reaching for them, but a guard swiftly kicked the box out of her reach. Marcus, meanwhile, snapped his suitcase shut with frantic, rigid movements. He stood up, gripping the leather handle tightly, his knuckles white with strain. He refused to look at me, keeping his eyes fixed squarely on the front door. He just wanted to escape, to run away from the humiliating reality of his total, absolute defeat. "I am leaving," Marcus declared, his voice trembling with a pathetic attempt at asserting his former authority. "You have your revenge, Zuri. Let me walk out of here." He took 2 rapid steps toward the foyer. DeAndre shifted his weight, smoothly blocking the exit with his massive frame. He reached out with one hand and grabbed the handle of Marcus's suitcase, stopping my father dead in his tracks. "Open it," DeAndre commanded, his voice a low, rumbling threat that demanded immediate compliance. "It is just my clothes," Marcus stammered, a fresh wave of sweat breaking out across his forehead. "I followed your rules. Let me go." DeAndre did not ask twice. He effortlessly yanked the suitcase out of Marcus's grip, dropping it heavily onto the marble floor. He unzipped the main compartment and flipped it open. Beneath a thin layer of wrinkled dress shirts and tailored slacks lay a flat, rectangular object wrapped tightly in a thick, protective wool blanket. DeAndre reached down and pulled the heavy bundle free. He unwrapped the wool, letting it fall away, to reveal a stunning, authentic, original oil painting. It was a 17th-century Dutch masterpiece, one of the most valuable pieces in the entire sterling collection, easily worth over $3 million on the private market. Marcus had meticulously unseated it from its custom frame in the study and tried to smuggle his final golden parachute right out the front door. I looked down at the painting and then slowly raised my eyes to meet my father's terrified gaze. Marcus was physically shaking, his chest heaving as his eyes darted around the room, realizing there was no safety net left to catch him. He had tried to steal from the very trust that had just spared him a federal prison sentence. DeAndre handed the painting to another guard and looked back at my father with absolute, unvarnished contempt. "That belongs to the trust," DeAndre stated, his voice echoing coldly against the marble walls. Marcus stood paralyzed as the painting was carried away by the security guard. His broad shoulders violently slumped forward. He looked down at his empty, trembling hands. He had absolutely nothing left to leverage. There were no secret offshore accounts, no hidden shell companies, no final brilliant legal maneuver to execute. He was a completely broken man. DeAndre pointed a massive finger toward the 2 identical black suitcases sitting near the marble entryway. Marcus grabbed the handles, his knuckles turning white with strained physical exertion. He dragged the heavy bags across the foyer, the cheap plastic wheels squeaking in loud, pathetic protest against the pristine imported stone. Valerie followed close behind him. Her face was a rigid mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. She clutched the handles of her own meager luggage, moving like a condemned prisoner, walking slowly toward the gallows. She had stripped off her diamond necklace, leaving it abandoned on the glass table. She wore a simple beige trench coat, a desperate, frantic attempt to maintain some fragile illusion of dignity. But her smeared makeup and hollow, vacant eyes betrayed the absolute destruction of her reality. Nia was already waiting on the front porch. She had not packed anything. She had absolutely nothing to pack. Everything she owned, every piece of designer clothing, every piece of jewelry, every vehicle she drove was legally tied to her arrested husband or her bankrupt parents. She fell into step behind them, a silent, ruined ghost haunting her own funeral march. The camera smoothly transitions into a steady tracking shot, locking in alongside Marcus, Valerie, and Nia as they begin the agonizingly long descent down the sprawling circular driveway. The gravel crunched loudly beneath their expensive leather shoes and the heavy rolling wheels of their luggage. The sound was deafening in the quiet, crisp morning air. For decades, they had glided down this exact driveway in chauffeur-driven Maybachs and imported European sports cars heavily insulated behind tinted bulletproof glass. Now they were forced to walk, dragging their own pathetic survival kits like common vagrants. The Sterling estate boasted one of the longest private driveways in all of Buckhead, winding gracefully through ancient oak trees and perfectly manicured hedges. Today, that distance was a brutal, psychological torture device. Every single step forced them to physically feel the crushing weight of their permanent exile. Marcus was sweating heavily beneath his tailored suit jacket, his breathing shallow and ragged. He refused to look left or right, keeping his eyes fixed squarely on the towering wrought iron gates looming in the distance. Valerie, however, could not stop looking, and that was her ultimate undoing. The news of the federal raid at the gala had spread through the exclusive Buckhead community with terrifying electric speed. The wealthy elites of Atlanta thrived on scandal, and the sudden total collapse of the Sterling Empire was the most spectacular blood sport they had ever witnessed. As Valerie dragged her suitcase past the edge of the manicured property line, she saw them. The neighbors were out. They stood freely on their sprawling verandas and at the edges of their immaculate green lawns, holding porcelain coffee cups, and watching the procession with unveiled, ravenous fascination. These were the exact same people Valerie had hosted for decades. The women she had sipped expensive mimosas with at the Botanical Society luncheons. The men Marcus had played high-stakes golf with at the private country club. Now they were staring at the Sterling family like diseased animals in a public zoo enclosure. Valerie let out a choked, humiliated sob. She raised a trembling hand, attempting to shield her face from the piercing, judgmental glares of her former peers. A sleek silver Porsche slowly cruised past them on the main road, the tinted window rolling down just enough for a prominent socialite to peer out. The socialite did not wave. She did not offer a single word of sympathy or comfort. She simply stared, taking in the pathetic, highly entertaining sight of Valerie Sterling dragging a scuffed suitcase through the street dirt. Valerie stumbled, her designer heel catching on a stray piece of jagged gravel. She fell hard onto her knees, scraping her bare legs against the rough stone. She looked up, expecting Marcus to stop and help her. Marcus did not even break his stride. He kept walking, his eyes dead and focused forward, completely abandoning his wife to the humiliating spectacle. Nia walked right past her mother, stepping over Valerie's dropped luggage without a single word or glance. It was the ultimate display of the toxic, selfish culture Valerie had meticulously cultivated in her family. When the money vanished, the loyalty evaporated instantly. Valerie scrambled to her feet, her expensive trench coat stained with dirt, her dignity completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She grabbed her bag and limped after her husband and daughter, the tears flowing freely now. The whispers of the neighbors seemed to echo through the trees, sharp and venomous. She had spent her entire life stepping on the throats of others to maintain her optical superiority, and now she was experiencing the brutal, unforgiving reality of the absolute bottom. They finally reached the massive wrought iron gates. The heavy metal doors swung open, mechanically operated by my security team from inside the main control room. Marcus, Valerie, and Nia stepped past the property line, and the gates instantly slammed shut behind them, locking with a heavy, reverberating metallic clang. They stood on the public concrete sidewalk. No luxury cars were waiting, no high-priced fixers were coming to rescue them. The morning commuter traffic whizzed past them, blowing cold exhaust and street dust directly into their faces. They were completely, entirely alone. Nia stopped walking. She slowly turned her body around, placing her bare, trembling hands on the cold iron bars of the gate. She looked back up the long, winding driveway. I was standing at the absolute peak of the grand staircase, beneath the towering stone columns of the mansion portico. The camera punches in, capturing the sheer magnitude of the physical and atmospheric distance between us. I stood tall, my posture immaculate, my expression an unreadable mask of cold, lethal authority. I wore the empire they had ruthlessly tried to steal from me. I possessed the absolute power they had tried to crush. Nia stared at me through the iron bars. Her pale lips trembled. She raised a single hesitant hand, a pathetic final attempt to elicit a shred of sisterly mercy. She desperately wanted me to wave. She wanted me to offer a sign that this was not permanent, that the biological blood connecting us still held some microscopic value. I looked at the woman who had framed me for theft, mocked my suffering, and actively tried to destroy my future. I looked at the parents who had gleefully participated in my execution. I did not wave. I did not smile. I simply turned my back to them. I walked with calculated grace through the threshold of the grand foyer. The massive custom oak double doors swung forward. They slammed shut with a deafening, thunderous boom, severing the Sterling family from my world forever. The heavy oak doors sealed with a deep, resonant thud, locking the cold morning air and the remnants of the Sterling family outside. The profound, absolute silence of the empty mansion instantly rushed in to fill the cavernous space. For the first time in 14 years, I stood in the grand foyer, not as an unwanted guest, not as a scapegoat, and certainly not as a victim. I stood as the undisputed owner. The camera transitions into a smooth, gliding Steadicam shot tracking my movements as I slowly began to walk through the sprawling estate. The morning sunlight sliced through the massive arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the quiet air. The house was a museum of fabricated perfection and toxic vanity. Valerie's meticulous interior design screamed of desperate wealth. Gilded mirrors, imported silk drapes, and marble pedestals displaying meaningless, expensive artifacts. But without the noise of their arrogance, without the constant hum of their elitist chatter, the house just felt like a massive hollow tomb. My heels clicked a steady, rhythmic beat against the polished stone as I crossed the threshold into the grand, formal dining room. I stopped at the edge of the sprawling mahogany table that could easily seat 30 guests. The camera slowly circles me, capturing my reflection in the polished wood. I looked at the chair situated at the absolute farthest end of the table. That was my seat. For 18 years of my life, I had been relegated to the darkest corner of this room, physically distanced from the warmth of the family center. I remembered sitting there in absolute silence, picking at my food while Marcus loudly toasted Nia's mediocre report cards. I remembered Valerie leaning over to adjust Nia's designer collar, while simultaneously glaring down the table to criticize my posture. They had engineered the very geography of this room to ensure I knew exactly how little I mattered. I ran my hand along the edge of the mahogany, feeling the cold, hard surface. It no longer held any power over me. It was just wood. I turned and continued my slow, deliberate march through the house, the Steadicam gliding smoothly ahead of me, guiding the audience deeper into the maze of my past trauma. I pushed open a set of heavy French doors and stepped into the sunroom. The air in my lungs suddenly felt tight. This was the room. The physical space remained exactly as it had been 14 years ago. The same cream-colored couches, the same antique Persian rug. The camera lingers on my face, capturing the ghosts of the past playing out in my mind. I could almost see my teenage self kneeling on that very rug, tears streaming down my face, desperately emptying my backpack to prove my innocence. I could see the bundles of stolen charity cash tumbling out, hitting the floor like explosive charges. I could hear Marcus roaring, his face twisted in pure, unadulterated disgust, calling me a thief, a liar, a permanent stain on his impeccable legacy. I could see Valerie turning her back, refusing to look at me, protecting her social standing over her own child. And standing right by the doorway, I could see Nia wearing a sick, satisfied smirk, having successfully planted the money and destroyed my life to cover her own tracks. The memory was vivid, but the paralyzing fear that used to accompany it was entirely gone. I breathed in the stale air of the sunroom and felt nothing but an overwhelming sense of closure. The ghosts were officially dead. The sharp sound of heavy work boots stomping against the marble foyer broke my reverie. The front doors had been propped open by DeAndre, and a crew of 20 professional contractors filed into the mansion. They wore heavy canvas tool belts, carried sledgehammers, pry bars, and massive industrial trash bins. They were not decorators. They were a demolition crew. The foreman, a burly man with a thick beard, stepped forward, pulling a blueprint from his pocket. Miss Sterling, he said respectfully, waiting for my instructions. We are ready when you are. Where do you want us to start? I walked out of the sunroom and stood at the base of the sweeping grand staircase, looking up at the towering walls adorned with Marcus's pretentious imported tapestries and Valerie's grotesque crystal sconces. I hated this house. I hated everything it represented. I was not going to live inside a monument built on my own suffering. Tear it all down, I commanded, my voice echoing with icy absolute clarity. Start with the formal dining room. Smash the mahogany table, rip the silk drapes off the windows, take sledgehammers to the marble pillars in the living room, and tear out the custom molding. I want every single trace of the people who lived here completely eradicated. Strip it down to the studs. The foreman nodded, signaling his crew. Within seconds, the pristine silence of the mansion was shattered by the brutal, glorious sound of destruction. Glass shattered, wood splintered, and drywall crumbled as the crew systematically began to dismantle the Sterling family's physical legacy. The noise was deafening, chaotic, and deeply therapeutic. I left the crew to their work and made my way up the grand staircase, the Steadicam following closely as I navigated the second floor. I walked directly past the lavish master suite and down the long corridor that led to Marcus's private home office. The room was a disaster zone of scattered files, open drawers, and shredded documents, a pathetic testament to his frantic, desperate packing. He had tried to sanitize his life before fleeing, but cowards always leave something behind. I walked behind his massive executive desk and stared at the dark wood paneling covering the back wall. Marcus was arrogant, but he was also deeply paranoid. Men who build empires on fraud always build hidden safety nets. I ran my hands along the grooves of the wood, pressing firmly against the decorative trim. A faint click echoed from the panel, and a section of the wood popped forward, revealing a digital biometric wall safe hidden directly behind his framed degrees. Marcus had clearly been in too much of a rush to empty it, or perhaps his shaking hands had failed the biometric scanner in his final moments of panic. I signaled for DeAndre, who stepped into the office carrying a heavy steel pry bar from the demolition crew downstairs. He did not ask questions. He wedged the thick steel bar into the seam of the safe, applying his massive leverage with a single violent thrust. The locking mechanism groaned and snapped, the metal door springing open. I reached inside the dark cavity. There were no stacks of offshore bearer bonds or hidden thumb drives. There was only a single faded velvet box sitting squarely in the center. I pulled it out, resting it in the palm of my hand. The velvet was worn soft from decades of handling. I popped the delicate brass latch and opened the lid. Resting on the faded silk lining was a vintage gold pocket watch, its face scratched and its chain heavy with age. The breath caught in my throat. It was not just any watch. It was Grandpa Isaiah's original timepiece, the very first significant purchase he had made after building his first successful company from the ground up. It was the physical anchor of the true Sterling legacy, the one built on hard work, integrity, and actual sacrifice before Marcus had corrupted the bloodline with greed. Marcus had kept it locked in the dark, treating it as a mere financial asset, a trophy of his dominance over the man who had actually built the foundation he squandered. I lifted the heavy gold watch from the box, feeling its cold weight against my skin. The ticking was faint but steady, a resilient heartbeat that had survived decades of darkness and betrayal. I closed my hand tightly around the gold metal, feeling a profound, absolute sense of victory lock into place. The final piece of the true legacy was no longer trapped in the shadows of fraud and vanity. It was safe, it was mine, and the empire was finally going to be rebuilt the right way. I slipped the pocket watch into my blazer pocket, keeping it close to my heart as I walked out of the ruined office. The harsh morning light that had illuminated their shameful exit gradually softened into a warm golden hour glow as the afternoon progressed. The demolition crew had finished their initial teardown of the ostentatious living spaces, leaving behind raw, exposed timber and bare concrete. It was beautiful in its absolute honesty. The superficial layers of Valerie's desperate wealth, the imported silk drapes, the grotesque crystal chandeliers, and the gilded molding had been ripped away and hauled into massive industrial dumpsters. The house was finally breathing. A slow, smooth dolly shot glides alongside me, tracking my deliberate path down the main hallway. The frantic, chaotic energy of the morning had completely vanished, replaced by a profound, deep-seated peace. I walked with my head held high, my footsteps echoing softly against the stripped floors. I was not rushing. I had all the time in the world. I reached the grand library at the end of the east wing. It was the one single room I had ordered the crew to leave entirely untouched for now. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the rich scent of aged paper and polished leather. The room was bathed in a warm amber light filtering through the tall windows. Above the massive stone fireplace hung a towering oil portrait of Grandpa Isaiah. He had kind, unyielding eyes and work-worn hands that gripped a simple leather ledger. Marcus had tried to relegate this painting to the basement years ago, claiming it clashed with the modern aesthetic. But the trust stipulations had legally forced him to keep it prominently displayed. I stood directly beneath the portrait, looking up at the man who had seen my potential when everyone else saw a convenient scapegoat. "We did it, Grandpa," I said aloud, my voice steady and clear, echoing off the towering mahogany shelves. "The rot has been entirely cut out. The people who tried to poison your name and steal your hard work have been permanently removed. I kept my promise to you." I took the vintage gold pocket watch out of my blazer and placed it gently on the mantel right beneath his painted gaze. I stood there in the quiet warmth of the room and told him everything. I told him how I had protected the core assets, how the shadow loans were exposed to the light, and how the false empire had crumbled under the sheer weight of its own arrogant greed. "They thought your trust was a cage," I whispered, feeling a profound sense of gratitude wash over me. "But it was a brilliant, flawless shield. You knew exactly what they were capable of, and you gave me the exact tools I needed to stop them. Thank you for trusting me with the keys to the kingdom." The heavy oak doors of the library creaked open, breaking the quiet moment. My lead attorney David stepped into the room carrying a thick leather binder. He walked over to the large reading table and spread the documents out under the warm glow of a brass desk lamp. "It is all ready, Zuri," David stated, handing me a solid gold fountain pen. "The city zoning approvals cleared an hour ago. The transfer of the deed is fully prepared for your signature." I walked over to the table and looked down at the crisp white legal papers. This was the ultimate reversal of the Sterling family curse. With fluid, confident strokes, I signed my name on the dotted lines. I was legally dissolving the status of the estate as a private luxury residence. I was signing the entire property and its accompanying grounds over to the newly established Isaiah Sterling Foundation for at-risk youth. The massive formal dining room where they had deliberately isolated me would become a collaborative cafeteria for kids who needed a safe place to eat. The sunroom where Nia had framed me for theft would be transformed into a state-of-the-art technology lab for underprivileged teenagers. The sprawling, immaculate lawns where Valerie hosted her vapid vanity galas would serve as community gardens and recreational spaces. I was taking a monument of elite exclusion and turning it into a fortress of absolute opportunity. Just as David closed the leather binder, my cell phone buzzed sharply in my pocket. I pulled it out, checking the caller ID. It was my executive assistant, Maya, calling with the final updates of the day. I answered the call, putting it on speaker and setting it down on the desk so David could hear the conclusion of our campaign. "We have the final status reports," Maya announced, her voice crisp and highly efficient. "The federal judge just issued a ruling on Preston. He was officially denied bail. The prosecution presented the wire fraud evidence alongside the hidden accounts you uncovered, and the judge deemed him a severe flight risk. He is being transferred to the maximum security holding facility to await trial. Nia's assets have been completely frozen pending the ongoing federal investigation. She has absolutely zero access to capital." A cool, satisfying wave of justice settled over the room. Preston's arrogant reign of white-collar crime was over, and Nia was finally facing the unshielded, brutal consequences of her actions without a single safety net to catch her. "And Marcus and Valerie?" I asked, keeping my tone entirely clinical. Maya cleared her throat, checking her notes. "We tracked their departure. They were turned away from 3 different luxury hotels in the city due to their canceled credit cards. They eventually checked into a cheap roadside motel off the interstate in the worst part of town. They booked a single room for the 3 of them, paying in whatever loose cash they had managed to scrape together from their pockets. They have no cars, no staff, and no remaining social contacts. The country club formally revoked their membership an hour ago. Everyone in Buckhead has completely blacklisted them. I looked back up at the portrait of Grandpa Isaiah. The golden child was destitute. The arrogant patriarch was ruined. The vain matriarch was entirely stripped of her precious social standing. The toxic parasitic culture they had built was dead and buried. Excellent work, Maya, I replied, terminating the call. I walked out of the library and stood on the front steps of the new foundation, breathing in the cool, clean evening air. The cycle of abuse was officially shattered and my real work was just beginning. The dust has finally settled. I sit perfectly still in the absolute center of the stripped-down living room, resting in a single vintage leather armchair, right where Valerie's pretentious imported velvet sofa used to be. The evening light filters softly through the bare, arched windows, casting long, uninterrupted shadows across the exposed concrete floors and the raw timber framing. It mirrors the very first frame of this entire journey, but the suffocating atmospheric weight of the Sterling Empire has been completely eradicated. I hold a heavy crystal glass of aged bourbon in my right hand, the amber liquid catching the fading golden light. The camera pushes in slowly, locking into a tight, intimate close-up of my face. I look directly into the lens, breaking the fourth wall with absolute chilling clarity. They sell us a very specific and highly manipulated lie about family from the exact moment we are born. We are socially conditioned to believe that shared DNA is an unbreakable sacred contract. We are taught from childhood that blind loyalty is an absolute requirement regardless of how deeply the people who share our last name betray us. Society constantly demands that we protect our own, that we keep our ugliest secrets hidden securely behind closed doors, and that we quietly absorb the abuse simply because the perpetrators happen to be our parents or our siblings. They constantly remind us of the old proverb to keep us trapped in the cycle. They tell you that blood is thicker than water. It is supposed to be the ultimate absolute defense for toxic behavior. It is the perfect universal excuse for decades of unchecked generational trauma. But they always forget the second half of that reality. They forget that water is what actually cleanses you. Water is what washes the dirt away. Water is what sustains life and promotes growth, while blood, when spilled and left out in the open, simply stagnates and rots. For 14 years, I let my bloodline rot. I deliberately stepped away from the radioactive poison they called love, and I chose the water. I chose the cold, clear, unforgiving reality of absolute independence. When you are the designated scapegoat of a narcissistic, wealthy family, everyone expects you to eventually crawl back. They expect the harsh outside world to break you down until you are desperate enough to accept their highly conditional affection. Marcus and Valerie assumed my sudden exile would permanently destroy me. Nia assumed my permanent absence would secure her undisputed position on the Golden Throne. They all foolishly believed that cutting me off would leave me starving and helpless in the dark. They never realized I was simply learning how to see in the dark. I learned how to read the exact blueprints of their staggering arrogance. I studied the precise structural architecture of their unrelenting greed. While they were busy drinking imported champagne at exclusive country club galas and spending millions of dollars they did not legally own, I was meticulously building a massive wrecking ball perfectly calibrated to the specific structural weaknesses of their fraudulent empire. People often ask if revenge is truly worth the immense psychological effort. Highly paid therapists will tell you to forgive and forget to protect your own peace. Spiritual guides will tell you to take the high road and leave the ultimate judgment to a higher power. They tell you that holding on to deep anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. But my anger was never poison. My anger was premium high-octane aviation fuel. It kept me warm when I had absolutely nothing else. It kept me hyper-focused when I was working 80-hour weeks in a cramped studio apartment. It gave me the terrifying, beautiful surgical clarity required to dismantle a corrupt corporate dynasty piece by piece. This was never about petty emotional vengeance. This was about absolute, unvarnished legal accountability. It was about forcing the people who broke all the rules to finally read the terms and conditions of their own destruction. I take a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon. The smooth heat travels down my throat, grounding me entirely in the victorious present moment. The camera slowly begins to dolly backward, pulling smoothly away from my face and gradually widening the shot. As the lens steadily retreats, the vast empty space of the mansion reveals itself. The bare walls stripped of their expensive art, the missing chandeliers, the total absolute absence of the Sterling family's suffocating vanity. The camera glides backward through the grand archway, passing over the threshold of the living room and moving smoothly into the cavernous marble foyer. I remain seated in the center of the frame, a solitary figure of absolute triumph, surrounded by the hollow echoing shell of a conquered kingdom. I look around at the exposed wooden beams and the pristine echoing silence. I feel zero guilt. I feel absolutely no remorse. I do not mourn the parents who never actually loved me, and I do not pity the sister who actively tried to destroy me. They made their calculated choices with full cognitive awareness, and today the ultimate bill finally came due. The Isaiah Sterling Foundation will bring actual life back into these dead walls. The massive wealth that was hoarded solely to intimidate others will now be distributed to empower those who truly need it. The curse ends with me. The camera continues its steady gliding retreat, moving backward through the massive entryway, capturing the sweeping grandeur of the stripped foyer one last time. At 14, I was thrown into a storm. I state my voice projecting clearly through the empty, echoing halls, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact with the retreating lens. I was told I would not survive the rain. I was told I would drown. But at 28, I became the storm. The camera slowly crosses the threshold of the front doors, backing out onto the grand stone portico. The evening air is crisp and cool. The shadows stretching across the estate are long and final. I sit perfectly still in the distance, raising my crystal glass in a final silent toast to the grandfather who gave me the keys to my own salvation. And the best part? I say my voice a quiet, lethal whisper that somehow effortlessly carries across the entire marble distance. I didn't even have to raise my voice to blow their house down. The heavy custom oak double doors smoothly swing inward. The gap narrows rapidly, cutting off the view of the stripped-down foyer and the solitary, victorious woman in the armchair. With a heavy, resonant, and deeply satisfying thud, the doors lock shut. The screen instantly cuts to black.